So, a single pellet of nuclear fuel, which is about the size of the eraser on the end of a pencil, contains roughly the same amount of energy as 1 ton of coal, or about 150 gallons of oil, or somewhere around 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas. One pellet. You can hold it in your hand at a fuel fabrication facility before it has been loaded into a reactor, and it is not noticeably radioactive. It is not warm. It does not glow. It just sort of sits there looking like a ceramic eraser. And inside of that little ceramic eraser is enough stored energy to power an average household for about 5 years. That is what we are talking about when we talk about nuclear power. And it is, by basically every metric anyone has come up with, the most energy dense, lowest carbon, and statistically safest way of producing electricity that humans have ever managed to figure out. And the response to all of that has been, somewhat predictably, to spend the last several decades shutting most of it down, protesting the construction of new ones, and treating the whole industry as if it were a slow motion catastrophe waiting to happen, which is the contradiction I want to talk about tonight. So, this is the entire story of nuclear energy from the very beginning, when a French physicist forgot to put some uranium salts away before going on a cloudy weekend in 1896 and accidentally discovered an entirely new property of matter, all the way through the squash court in Chicago, where a team of scientists started the first sustained chain reaction in human history through the nuclear submarine program that essentially built the modern reactor industry by accident, through every major accident, every weird Cold War atomic age dream that never went anywhere, and right up to where we are now, with a small handful of countries getting most of their electricity from this technology, and the rest of the world still mostly trying to decide what to do about it. It is going into this way more of a meandering and strange story than I expected, and a lot of the people involved are scientists you have never heard of, who did things that seem absolutely insane by modern standards, and whose decisions, in some cases, are still affecting things that happen today. So settle in, because this is going to take a while. Before I get into any of it, the usual housekeeping: I am not a nuclear physicist. I am not a nuclear engineer. I am not an expert on radiation. I am not actually a professional in this field, or in any field, really. I am just a guy who reads a lot, gets curious about things, sits down with a microphone, and tells you what I learned. So, if at any point in the next several hours I get a detail slightly wrong, or oversimplify something a working physicist would object to, that is what is going on. I do my best to get the facts right, and I check everything I say against multiple sources, but I am still just a guy talking to you in the middle of the night. Two more quick things, and then I promise I will start. The first is that if you are not already subscribed to the channel and you are enjoying any of this, it would mean a lot if you did. It is the single biggest thing that helps these videos get made, and the only way I get to keep sitting down and reading about strange historical rabbit holes for hours on end, and then telling you about them at 3 in the morning. The second is that I also have a Patreon, and the main thing it gets you is that all of these episodes are available on Spotify, completely ad-free, in the same Yap session format you are listening to right now. So, if you would rather drift off without hearing about car insurance and meal kits halfway through, the Patreon is the way to do that. And it also directly supports the channel and lets me keep doing this. Link in the description. Either way, whether you sign up for any of that or not, thank you for being here. Now, with that out of the way, so to understand how any of this got started, we have to go back to the 1890s, which was a time when physics was, for lack of a better way to put it, in a kind of crisis. The atomic theory of matter, the idea that everything is made up of tiny particles called atoms, had been around for a while, but the atom itself was still thought to be the smallest indivisible unit of stuff. You could not split it, you could not look inside of it, and as far as anyone knew, that was that. Then in 1895, a German physicist named Wilhelm Röntgen was working with something called a cathode ray tube, which is a glass tube that has been evacuated of air and has electric current passing through it. These tubes were not new. They had been around for decades, and physicists had been playing with them and using them to study electricity and various properties of gases. But Röntgen noticed something nobody had noticed before. He had a screen in his lab that had been coated with a fluorescent material called barium platinocyanide, and when he ran current through the cathode ray tube, the screen lit up, even when the tube was covered in thick black cardboard. Whatever was coming out of the tube was going through the cardboard, through the air, and exciting the fluorescent screen across the room. He spent the next several weeks alone in his lab, basically barely sleeping, trying to figure out what this thing was. He tried blocking it with various materials, and he found that it would pass through wood, through cardboard, through thin metal, but it would not pass through dense things like lead. And famously, he took a photographic plate, put his wife's hand in front of it, and ran the cathode ray tube, and got back a photograph that showed the bones in her hand and the outline of her wedding ring. When she saw it, she is said to have remarked that she had seen her own death, which is not a particularly cheerful way to react to the first ever medical X-ray, but it is also not an unreasonable reaction to seeing the skeleton inside of your own hand for the first time in human history. He called the new rays X-rays because he did not know what they were, and X is the standard mathematical symbol for an unknown, and the discovery essentially set off a panic among physicists everywhere, who all immediately started trying to figure out where else this new kind of radiation might be lurking. And this is where Henri Becquerel comes in. Becquerel was a French physicist who came from a family of physicists. His father had been a physicist, his grandfather had been a physicist, and he himself was working in Paris on the phenomenon of phosphorescence, which is the property of some materials to glow in the dark after being exposed to light. When the news of Röntgen's X-rays reached Paris, Becquerel got it into his head that maybe phosphorescent materials, which were known to emit visible light after being charged up by the sun, might also emit X-rays. So he started experimenting with uranium salts, which were a known phosphorescent material at the time and were sitting around in his laboratory because his father had collected them. His plan was to put the uranium salts on a photographic plate wrapped in black paper, leave them out in the sun to charge up, and then see if anything had gotten through the paper and exposed the plate. And in February of 1896, he tried this for the first time and got a positive result, which he assumed meant his hypothesis was correct. The sun, he thought, was activating the uranium salts and causing them to give off X-rays. But then the weather changed. Paris got cloudy day after day, and Becquerel could not get any sunlight to charge his samples with. So he just put everything in a drawer and waited. Days passed, the weather did not improve, and at some point, for reasons that historians still cannot completely explain, he decided to develop the photographic plate anyway. Even though it had been sitting in the dark with the uranium salts for several days and had not been exposed to any sunlight, he probably expected to see nothing, or at most a faint outline. What he got back was a fully exposed plate with a very strong image of the uranium sample on it. The uranium had been emitting whatever this radiation was on its own, in the dark, without any need for sunlight to activate it. He had stumbled onto a property of matter that nobody had ever observed before. Atoms, or at least uranium atoms, were spontaneously giving off energy from nowhere, and they had been doing it the entire time, and nobody had noticed. He announced his findings to the French Academy of Sciences a few weeks later, and the discovery was so strange that, for a while, nobody knew what to make of it. Now, to give you a sense of how lucky this discovery was, there is a fairly famous quote from the Roman philosopher Seneca, which goes something like, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." Becquerel had spent his entire life studying phosphorescence. He was an expert in photography. His lab was full of uranium because his father had been interested in it, and he happened to be working in Paris during a stretch of cloudy weather. If any one of those things had been different, he might not have made the discovery and the entire history of physics, of nuclear energy, of the 20th century, might have gone in a completely different direction, and the International Unit of Radioactivity, which is the unit used today to measure how radioactive a thing is called the becquerel, named after him. 1 becquerel is 1 atomic nucleus in a material decaying per second. And the fact that this unit exists is essentially because a Frenchman was bored on a cloudy weekend and decided to develop a photograph that he was reasonably sure had nothing on it. Okay, so now we get to one of the most famous figures in this entire story, and one of the most interesting, which is Marie Curie. Curie was born Maria Salomea Sklodowska in Warsaw in 1867, in a Poland that did not exist as an independent country at the time because it had been partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. She had grown up in an academic family. Her father had been a physics and mathematics teacher, but the Russian authorities did not allow women to attend university in Warsaw. So she had spent years working as a governess to save up enough money to go study in Paris, where she eventually arrived in 1891 and where she eventually met and married a French physicist named Pierre Curie. She and Pierre had been looking for a research topic for her doctoral thesis, and after seeing Becquerel's findings, she decided to investigate the strange uranium rays. She started by trying to measure how strong the radiation from various uranium samples was, and very quickly noticed that different samples gave off different amounts of radiation. Some of them gave off more radiation than pure uranium should have, which did not make any sense. She and Pierre started chemically separating the samples to try to figure out what was going on, and over a period of years, working in what was basically a shed at the Paris Municipal School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry, they isolated two new elements, both of which were way more radioactive than uranium. The first one they named polonium, after Marie's birthplace of Poland, which at the time was not a recognized country, and Marie wanted to draw attention to that fact. The second one they named radium, from the Latin word for ray, and the term radioactivity, the word itself, was coined by Marie to describe this entirely new phenomenon they were observing. Now, to give you a sense of how little anyone understood about radiation safety at this point, Marie Curie used to walk around her laboratory with vials of radium in her coat pockets. She would store radioactive materials in her desk drawers. She kept them out in the open on shelves because, as she described it, she liked how they looked like, quote, faint fairy lights, end quote, glowing softly in the dark. She would handle radium with her bare hands, and her notebooks and laboratory equipment ended up coated in radioactive residue. And here is a small detail that I keep finding hard to wrap my head around. Marie Curie died in 1934 of aplastic anemia, which was almost certainly caused by her decades of radiation exposure. She was buried, eventually, in a lead-lined coffin, but her notebooks, which are now in the French National Library in Paris, are still radioactive today, and they will continue to be radioactive for around another 1500 years. Because the half-life of radium-226 is roughly 1600 years. Anyone who wants to read her notebooks has to sign a waiver and put on protective gear. Her clothes, her furniture, her cookbooks, all still radioactive. The cookbooks, in particular, are a thing I find genuinely strange. The woman whose research arguably started the entire field of nuclear physics has cookbooks that, thanks to her own research, you cannot really touch. And it gets stranger than that, because the period after the Curies discovered radium is now sometimes called the radium craze. And it was basically a couple of decades during which consumer product companies in Europe and the United States put radium into absolutely everything. There was radium toothpaste, marketed as making your teeth whiter and your gums healthier, because the slight glow would, supposedly, brighten your smile. There was radium water, sold as a kind of health tonic, because the radioactivity was thought to be invigorating. There was radium cosmetics, including face creams that contained measurable amounts of radium and were marketed to women as a way to give their skin a healthy glow, which it did in the most literal possible sense. There was radium suppositories, advertised as treating various intestinal complaints, which I will not go into further. There was a product called Radithor, which was a brand of radium water sold in the United States from 1918 to about 1928, and which became famous because one of its biggest fans, a wealthy industrialist named Eben Byers, drank about 3 bottles of it a day for several years, and eventually died in 1932 of jaw cancer and bone necrosis after his teeth and most of his jaw had fallen out. The Wall Street Journal headline at the time was, quote, "The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off," end quote, which is one of the more brutal newspaper headlines I have ever read. The Raditor manufacturer was eventually forced out of business, and the Food and Drug Administration started actually regulating radioactive consumer products shortly afterwards. There was also, separately, a story called The Radium Girls, which is one of the more well-known industrial worker rights cases of the early 20th century, and which I think is worth telling because it is the reason a lot of modern occupational health and safety law exists. So, in the 1910s and 20s, several factories in the United States, mainly in New Jersey and Illinois and Connecticut, employed young women to paint the numbers on watch dials with a radium-based luminous paint called Undark. The paint contained radium-226 mixed with zinc sulfide, and it glowed in the dark, which was useful for watches that you wanted to be able to read at night. The work required very precise brushwork, and the women, who were often teenagers, were trained to lick the tip of the brush between strokes to give it a fine point, a technique they were told was, quote, lip dip paint, end quote. Each lick of the brush put a tiny amount of radium into their mouths. Over years of doing this, they accumulated significant amounts of radium in their bones, where it replaced calcium and decayed slowly, irradiating their bone marrow. By the early 1920s, the women started getting sick. Their teeth fell out, their jaws crumbled, they developed bone tumors. Many of them died in their 20s. The factories denied that the radium was the cause and tried to attribute the illnesses to other things, including, in one case, syphilis, which was a particularly nasty accusation to make against a group of young women in the 1920s. The women, who were given the name Radium Girls by the press, eventually sued the United States Radium Corporation and other factories in a series of legal cases that helped establish the right of workers to sue their employers for occupational illness. The cases also led to actual safety regulations being put in place for industries that worked with radioactive materials. The factories were forced to provide protective equipment, and the lip dip technique was banned. Several of the original Radium Girls lived long enough to testify in their lawsuits, sometimes literally being carried into the courtroom because they could no longer walk. The settlements they won were small by modern standards, but the legal precedent they established was, in retrospect, one of the most important worker safety cases in American history. She and Pierre and Becquerel shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903 for their work on radioactivity. Marie also won a second Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1911 for the discovery of radium and polonium, which made her the first person to win two Nobel Prizes and the first woman to win one in the first place. Pierre, sadly, did not live to see most of this. He was killed in 1906 when he slipped while crossing a Paris street in the rain and was run over by a horse-drawn carriage, which is one of those facts that you read and immediately want to double-check because it sounds made up, but it is just what happened. Marie took over his teaching position at the Sorbonne, which made her the first female professor there, and continued her work on radioactivity for the rest of her life. So, at this point, around the turn of the 20th century, here is what physicists know about the atom. They know that atoms exist. They know that some atoms, specifically the ones that are radioactive, are giving off energy spontaneously. They know that this energy comes in at least two forms, which Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealand-born physicist working in England, named alpha and beta radiation, after the first two letters of the Greek alphabet. They also know about a third type, gamma radiation, which is similar to X-rays. What they do not know is where any of this energy is coming from. The atom is supposed to be indivisible. There is not supposed to be anything inside of it. And yet, somehow, certain atoms are pumping out energy that has to be coming from somewhere. This is where Rutherford comes in properly, because he is the next major figure in the story. Rutherford had been studying radioactivity since the late 1890s, and in 1909, he and his collaborators ran an experiment that is now considered to be one of the most important experiments in the history of physics. The setup was this. He took a thin sheet of gold foil, just a few atoms thick, and he fired alpha particles at it. Alpha particles, which we now know are helium nuclei, are relatively heavy and carry a positive electric charge. The expectation, based on the model of the atom at the time, which was called the plum pudding model and was proposed by J. J. Thomson, was that most of the alpha particles should pass straight through the foil with maybe a tiny bit of deflection, because the atom was thought to be a kind of diffuse blob of positive charge with electrons embedded in it like the plums in a pudding. And most of them did, in fact, pass straight through. But every once in a while, an alpha particle would bounce almost straight back, as if it had hit something solid. Rutherford famously said that this result was about as believable as if you had fired a 15-inch artillery shell at a piece of tissue paper and watched it bounce back and hit you. It was, in his words, almost incredible, but the implication was that the atom must contain something really small and really dense at its center, something concentrated enough to deflect an alpha particle. And that is how the atomic nucleus was discovered. The model of the atom changed more or less overnight, from the plum pudding to what is essentially the modern model, which has a tiny, dense nucleus in the center containing almost all of the mass and electrons orbiting around it at a relatively huge distance. To give you a sense of the scale, if you blew up an atom to the size of a football stadium, the nucleus would be roughly the size of a pea sitting on the center spot. The rest is empty space. Now, Rutherford did not just discover the nucleus, he also figured out that radioactive decay, the process Becquerel had stumbled onto, was actually the transformation of one element into another. When uranium gave off an alpha particle, it became thorium. When thorium gave off another alpha particle, it became radium, and so on, down a chain, until eventually you ended up with stable lead. This was, in a way, the realization of the alchemist's old dream, the transformation of one element into another, although nobody was getting gold out of it. They were getting smaller and smaller atoms, releasing energy at every step, and it raised the obvious question, which is, if elements are transforming themselves, releasing energy as they do it, where is this energy coming from? And the answer, which would not be fully worked out for another 2 decades, was that the energy was coming from inside the nucleus itself, from a tiny fraction of the mass of the atom being converted directly into energy, according to a formula that Albert Einstein had published in 1905, which you have probably seen on t-shirts, the famous E equals mc squared. So this brings us to 1932, which is a very important year in this story. In 1932, the British physicist James Chadwick discovered the neutron. Up until that point, the nucleus of the atom had been thought to contain just protons, which carry a positive electric charge, and somehow also electrons to balance out the charge. The numbers had never quite worked out, and Rutherford had actually predicted more than a decade earlier that there should be a third particle in there somewhere with no charge that would account for the extra mass, but nobody had been able to find it. Chadwick figured out how to detect it by bombarding beryllium with alpha particles, which knocked these mysterious neutral particles out of the beryllium nuclei. He published his results, and overnight the picture of the nucleus changed again to one with protons and neutrons packed together at the center, held by what we now call the strong nuclear force, and electrons orbiting around the outside. The discovery of the neutron is what made the entire nuclear age possible, because the neutron is basically the key to splitting the atom. Neutrons have no electric charge, so they can pass right through the electron cloud around an atom and get to the nucleus without being repelled. Protons, by contrast, are positively charged, and if you want to get a proton into a nucleus, you have to fire it at incredibly high speeds to overcome the electrical repulsion. Neutrons just sort of drift in, and once they are in the nucleus, they can cause all sorts of interesting things to happen, including eventually splitting it. But that part would not come until later. In 1932, the immediate effect of Chadwick's discovery was that physicists everywhere started firing neutrons at things to see what would happen, and the results over the next several years were extraordinary. One of the physicists who jumped onto this immediately was an Italian named Enrico Fermi, who was working at the University of Rome. Fermi was, by basically all accounts, one of the most talented physicists of his generation, equally skilled at theoretical and experimental physics, which is rare. He realized that if you wanted to use neutrons to study nuclei, you should probably slow them down first, because slow neutrons are more likely to be absorbed by a nucleus than fast ones. He figured out that you could slow down neutrons by passing them through what he called a moderator, which could be water or paraffin wax or graphite, anything containing lots of hydrogen atoms, which neutrons bounce off of and lose energy to. And then he started firing slow neutrons at every element on the periodic table just to see what happened. What he found with most elements was that the slow neutrons would be absorbed by the nuclei, and the atoms would become heavier isotopes of themselves. So if you fired a slow neutron at a stable atom, you might get a heavier, often radioactive isotope. And in some cases, you would get a heavier element entirely, because the neutron would be absorbed, and then beta decay, turning a neutron into a proton, would push the atom up one slot in the periodic table. This was how Fermi discovered, or thought he had discovered, several new artificial elements, heavier than any natural element. He bombarded uranium, which was the heaviest natural element known at the time, with slow neutrons, and he got back something that did not chemically match any of the known elements lighter than uranium. So he concluded that he had created element 93, and possibly even 94, by adding neutrons to uranium nuclei. He named them alcenium and hesperium, after the ancient names for the Italian peninsula and Hesperia, and he won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1938 for this work. Except, and this is where the story takes a turn, he had not actually created new elements. What he had done, although he and almost everybody else in the field did not realize it for several more years, was split the uranium atom in half. The new chemical signatures he was seeing were not transuranic elements. They were fragments of uranium, much lighter atoms like barium and krypton and strontium that had been produced when the uranium nuclei broke apart. But because the idea that a tiny neutron could split a giant uranium nucleus into roughly equal halves was so wildly outside of anything anyone expected, nobody saw it, including Fermi, including, for a long time, the chemists at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, who were doing the most careful work on this exact question. And the chemists at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute who came closest to seeing it first was a man named Otto Hahn, who had been collaborating for 30 years with an Austrian physicist named Lise Meitner. And this is where the story gets, in my opinion, way more interesting and way more sad than I had expected going into it. Meitner had been born in Vienna in 1878, the third of 8 children in a Jewish family. She had been one of the first women to earn a PhD in physics from the University of Vienna in 1906, and she had moved to Berlin shortly afterwards to attend the lectures of Max Planck. She started collaborating with Hahn, who was a chemist, and the two of them worked together for the next 3 decades on various problems in radioactivity. They discovered the element protactinium together. They investigated nuclear isomerism, and by the 1930s, they were nominated for the Nobel Prize 10 years in a row. They never won, at least not at the time. Meitner was, by every account, an exceptional physicist, and she and Hahn had a partnership that combined her physics knowledge with his chemistry skills in a way that produced some of the best work being done in the field anywhere. The problem was that Meitner was Jewish, and the year was now the 1930s, and Hitler had come to power in Germany in 1933. Because Meitner was Austrian by citizenship rather than German, she was initially exempt from the Nazi racial laws, and she kept working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute longer than most of her Jewish colleagues. But in March of 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and Meitner instantly became a German citizen, which meant she was subject to the Nuremberg laws, which meant she was no longer allowed to work in scientific institutions. She tried for several months to figure out a way to leave Germany. Her Austrian passport was no longer valid. The Danish embassy refused to give her a visa. She was running out of time, and the regime was becoming increasingly aggressive about preventing Jewish scientists from emigrating because they did not want them to take their knowledge abroad. In July of 1938, with the help of several friends and colleagues, Meitner essentially fled Germany. She was smuggled across the border into the Netherlands by a Dutch physicist named Dirk Koster. Before she left, Otto Hahn gave her a diamond ring that he had inherited from his mother in case she needed to bribe a border guard. She made it across, and she eventually got to Stockholm, where she had been offered a position at the Nobel Institute. She arrived with 2 suitcases of summer clothes, 10 German marks in her purse, and basically no equipment to continue her research with. She was 60 years old. Hahn, meanwhile, kept working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, along with another chemist named Fritz Strassmann. They were still trying to figure out what was going on when they bombarded uranium with neutrons, and the results just kept getting weirder. By December of 1938, they were getting clear chemical signatures of barium in their samples. Barium is element 56, which is roughly half the mass of uranium. Element 92. There was no way for barium to have gotten into their samples by any normal process. The conclusion that the uranium nuclei had simply broken in half was so wild that Hahn could not bring himself to write it down. Instead, he wrote to Meitner in Sweden, asking her what she thought might be going on. He more or less said, "Look, this is what we are seeing. You are the theoretical physicist. Please tell us what this means, because we cannot make any sense of it." So Meitner got Hahn's letter just before Christmas of 1938. She was staying at a small hotel in a town called Kungälv on the Swedish coast, and her nephew, Otto Robert Frisch, who was also a physicist and was working in Copenhagen at the time, had come to visit her for the holiday. According to Frisch's account, he found her at breakfast the next morning brooding over Hahn's letter, and the two of them went for a walk in the snow to talk it over. He skied alongside her while she walked, and she told him later that she could walk as fast as he could ski, which was probably true. They walked through the woods, sat down on a fallen tree, and worked through the math. What they realized was this: the uranium nucleus, which is a relatively large and unstable nucleus, can be thought of as a kind of charged droplet of nuclear matter. When a slow neutron is absorbed by the nucleus, it adds a little bit of extra energy and disturbs the shape of the droplet. Under certain conditions, the droplet can elongate, form a narrow waist in the middle, and then split into two roughly equal smaller droplets, which fly apart due to the mutual repulsion of their positive charges. Meitner calculated on the spot that the energy released by this process should be about 200 million electron volts per uranium nucleus, which is a vast amount of energy compared to any chemical reaction. The mass of the two new nuclei would be slightly less than the mass of the original uranium, and the missing mass would have been converted into energy, exactly according to Einstein's formula. Frisch went back to Copenhagen after Christmas, and on the way he ran into Niels Bohr, who was about to leave for the United States by ship. He told Bohr what he and his aunt had worked out, and Bohr, who was one of the most prominent physicists of the era, slapped his own forehead and said, "Oh, what idiots we have been. We could have foreseen it all. This is just as it must be." Frisch did some additional experiments in Copenhagen to confirm the process was actually happening, and he and Meitner wrote up their results, which they sent to the journal Nature in January of 1939. Frisch needed a name for the new process, and he asked the biologist at the Bohr Institute what biologists called it when a cell divides into two cells. The biologist told him it was called binary fission, so Frisch shortened it to just fission, and that was the name that stuck. The act of a uranium nucleus splitting in two is formally called nuclear fission, and the word was borrowed by a physicist who needed something to call it from biology. Now, here is the part that I find genuinely awful. When the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded for the discovery of nuclear fission in 1944, it went to Otto Hahn alone. Meitner was not credited at all. The official reasoning at the time was that the Nobel Prize for Chemistry should go to a chemist, and Hahn had done the chemical work that detected the barium in the samples, while Meitner's contribution had been the theoretical explanation, which would be a physics prize matter, but Hahn could have insisted that Meitner be included, and he did not. In his Nobel acceptance speech, he referred to Meitner as merely a, quote, lab colleague, end quote, without naming her. Meitner was, by all accounts, devastated. She and Hahn continued to correspond after the war, but their relationship was never the same. Meitner herself once said of the omission that Hahn was, quote, simply suppressing the past in Nazi Germany. I am part of his suppressed past, end quote. She was nominated for the Nobel Prize 48 separate times across her career, and she never won. Meitner also refused vehemently to work on the Manhattan Project when she was approached. When Frisch wrote to her in 1943 asking her to join the bomb effort, she replied, I will have nothing to do with a bomb. She had foreseen quite early that fission could be used to make a weapon of essentially unlimited destructive power, and she wanted nothing to do with it. When she eventually visited the United States after the war, President Truman, when he was introduced to her, supposedly said, So you are the little lady who got us into all of this. Which is a quote that just gets worse the more times you read it. She died in 1968 at the age of 89. Her epitaph, written by her nephew Frisch, who knew her better than anyone, reads, Lise Meitner, a physicist who never lost her humanity. Element 109 on the periodic table, which was discovered in 1982, is named Meitnerium in her honor. She is, so far, the only non-mythological woman to have an element exclusively named after her. Curium, which is also on the periodic table, is named after both Marie and Pierre Curie, but Meitnerium is just for Meitner. It is a kind of acknowledgement, even if it came almost a century late. Okay, so it is now early 1939, and the discovery of fission has just hit the physics community. The results from Hahn and Strassman's experiments, combined with Meitner and Frisch's theoretical explanation, are published in Nature, and within weeks, physics laboratories all over the world are repeating the experiments and confirming the results. And the implication that everyone immediately grasps is that if each fission of a uranium nucleus releases not just energy, but also a few extra neutrons, then those extra neutrons could go on to cause more fissions, which would release more neutrons, which would cause more fissions, and so on, in a self-sustaining chain reaction. If you can get this chain reaction to work, you can release the energy of an enormous number of uranium atoms in a very short period of time, which is to say, you can build a bomb. Alternatively, if you can control the chain reaction so it does not run away, you can use it to generate electricity or heat or steam. Either way, fission is, from this moment, no longer a purely academic curiosity. It is potentially the basis for both a weapon and a power source, unlike anything humans have ever had. The physicist who probably grasped the chain reaction concept fastest, and who deserves a lot of credit that he never quite got, was a Hungarian theoretical physicist named Leo Szilard. Szilard had actually figured out the basic idea of a nuclear chain reaction way back in 1933, before fission had even been discovered. He had been crossing the street in London, the story goes, and the idea came to him while he was waiting at a traffic light on Southampton Row, that if you could find a nuclear reaction that emitted more neutrons than it absorbed, you could sustain a chain reaction and release essentially unlimited energy. He filed a patent for the concept the following year while working at the Admiralty in London, and assigned the patent to the British government so it would not fall into the wrong hands. At the time, nobody knew of any reaction that fit the bill. He was basically betting that one would be discovered. So, when fission was discovered in 1939, Szilard, who had since moved to the United States, was already primed for it. He understood almost immediately what it meant. He understood also that Germany, which still had the world's leading nuclear physics community, despite the exodus of Jewish scientists, was now going to be in a race to build a bomb. And he started trying to figure out how to get the United States government to take this seriously. He drafted a letter with the help of two other Hungarian physicists, Eugene Wigner and Edward Teller, addressed to President Franklin Roosevelt, warning him about the possibility of a German atomic bomb and urging the United States to start its own nuclear research program. They needed somebody famous enough to sign the letter to get Roosevelt's attention, so they took it to Albert Einstein, who was at the time the most famous scientist in the world, and asked him to sign it. Einstein read it, agreed with the analysis, and signed the Einstein letter. As it became known, eventually reached Roosevelt in October of 1939, after some delay. Roosevelt's response was basically to set up an advisory committee on uranium, which did some preliminary work, but did not really do much of anything for the next couple of years. The actual full-scale effort to build an atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project, did not get going until late 1941, after Pearl Harbor and after the United States entered the war. By that point, Szilard Fermi, who had also emigrated from Italy to escape racial laws that affected his Jewish wife, and several other refugee physicists were all working in the United States, and they all understood that whoever figured out a controlled fission chain reaction first was going to have a significant advantage in the war. The Manhattan Project was, by basically every metric, the largest scientific and engineering project in history up to that point. It cost about $2 billion, which, in today's money, is somewhere around $30 billion. It employed roughly 130,000 people across dozens of sites in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. It produced two distinct kinds of atomic bomb, one fueled by uranium-235, the rare fissile isotope of uranium, and one fueled by plutonium-239, an artificial element that does not occur in nature in any meaningful amounts and had to be created in nuclear reactors. And the very first step, the very first thing that had to be proven before anything else could happen, was that a controlled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction could be made to work at all. This is the part of the story that I think is probably the most famous, but the details are way weirder than I expected going into it. The site chosen for the first nuclear reactor was the University of Chicago, partly because Chicago was centrally located and far from both coasts, partly because the university already had a strong physics and chemistry department, and partly because the metallurgical laboratory, which was the project's code name, needed a place where it could do classified work without too much oversight. The team was led by Arthur Holly Compton, a Nobel laureate, and the actual reactor was designed and built under the direction of Enrico Fermi. The plan was to construct the reactor at a site outside of Chicago called Argonne Woods Forest Preserve, but a construction dispute halted work at that site, and Fermi convinced Compton that they could build it on the University of Chicago campus instead. The location they ended up choosing was a converted squash court underneath the abandoned west viewing stands of Stagg Field, which was the university's old football stadium. So, just to be clear about this, the first nuclear reactor in human history was built underneath the bleachers of a college football stadium in the middle of a major American city by a small team of about 30 people, including refugee physicists from Italy and Hungary and a few graduate students. There was no containment vessel. There was no cooling system. There was no shielding. The whole thing was, as Fermi himself described it, quote, a crude pile of black bricks and wooden timbers, end quote. It got the name Chicago Pile 1, abbreviated CP1, because the word pile was what they were using for the structure, since it was basically a pile of graphite bricks with uranium slugs embedded in it. And the original plan, before they realized the experiment would work with less material than they had expected, was to make it roughly spherical about 7.5 meters tall, containing about 46 tons of uranium fuel and about 385 tons of graphite as a moderator. Construction of the pile started on the 6th of November, 1942, and it went critical on the 2nd of December of that same year. Critical in this context means that the chain reaction was self-sustaining, that each fission was producing, on average, exactly one neutron that went on to cause another fission, neither more nor less. The way they controlled this was with cadmium control rods, which are rods made of a material that absorbs neutrons very well and which could be inserted into the pile to slow down or stop the reaction, and withdrawn to let it speed up. On the day of the experiment, about 49 people were present, including Fermi, Szilard, Compton, and one woman named Leona Woods, who was the only female researcher on the team and who took over the countdown at the start of the experiment. The control rod was withdrawn slowly, in stages, while Fermi and his team monitored the neutron counters to see if the reaction was sustaining itself. At 3:53 in the afternoon, after 28 minutes of operation, Fermi declared that the reaction was self-sustaining and the pile had gone critical for the first time. The total power output was about half a watt, which is less than the power consumption of a small flashlight. To say this another way, the first sustained nuclear chain reaction in human history produced about as much power as a nightlight, but that was beside the point. The point was that it worked. Compton called the project director, James Conant, on the phone and gave him a coded message, more or less off the top of his head, telling him that the experiment had been a success. He said, "The Italian navigator has landed in the New World," and Conant asked how the natives were, and Compton said, "Very friendly." And then everybody who had been working on the pile celebrated by passing around a single bottle of Italian Chianti wine, which they drank out of paper cups. According to the various accounts, almost everyone who was there signed the straw-covered wrapper of the empty wine bottle afterwards, and that wrapper with the signatures is the only written record of who exactly was present at the start of the atomic age. There was no toast, there was no speech. They just signed the wrapper, finished their wine, and went back to work. So, with the chain reaction proven to work, the rest of the Manhattan Project ramped up dramatically. The reactor was eventually moved in a disassembled form to the Argonne Woods site outside of Chicago, where it was reassembled and continued to operate for several more years under various names. Much larger reactors were built at Hanford in Washington state to produce plutonium for the bomb, and a massive uranium enrichment facility was built at Oak Ridge in Tennessee to produce uranium 235. The first nuclear weapons were tested at the Trinity site in New Mexico in July of 1945, and a few weeks later, the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war with Japan ended shortly afterwards. But before we get to the post-war era, there is a smaller and absolutely awful story from the Manhattan Project that I want to tell, because it is one of the more memorable things I read about in researching this video. And because it is genuinely a thing that happened, it is the story of what the Los Alamos physicists called the demon core. So, in the spring of 1945, Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico was working on multiple atomic bomb designs at once. The plutonium implosion bomb, which was the kind that was tested at Trinity and dropped on Nagasaki, required a plutonium core, which was a roughly 6 kilogram sphere of plutonium 239. To work properly, the core needed to be very precisely the right size to go critical, which is to say, to sustain a chain reaction once it was compressed by the surrounding explosives. Determining exactly the right size required experiments, which the physicists called criticality experiments, and which involved bringing the core close to a critical configuration using neutron reflecting materials and then measuring how close it got. They call these experiments, with no irony at all, tickling the dragon's tail, because if anything went wrong, the dragon would burn you. The third plutonium core that was produced at Los Alamos, which was originally intended for a third atomic bomb to be used against Japan, but ended up not being needed because Japan surrendered first, became the test bed for these criticality experiments. The core itself was a sphere of plutonium 239, about 3.5 inches in diameter, weighing about 6.2 kilograms. It was, by any reasonable measure, a quite small object. It was, by any reasonable measure, also incredibly dangerous, because it was a hair's breadth from being able to sustain a chain reaction all by itself. If you brought a neutron reflector close to it, the reflector would bounce neutrons that would otherwise have escaped back into the core, and the core would become critical, and then supercritical, and then bad things would happen very quickly. On the 21st of August, 1945, a physicist named Harry Daghlian was working alone in the laboratory late at night doing a criticality experiment. He was stacking tungsten carbide bricks around the core to see how close to criticality he could get. The bricks were acting as neutron reflectors. He was monitoring the neutron count as he added bricks. As he went to add the final brick, the neutron counter spiked, indicating that adding that brick would push the core into criticality. He tried to back away while still holding the brick, but he fumbled it and the brick dropped directly onto the core. The plutonium instantly went supercritical, and Daghlian, in a fraction of a second, was exposed to a fatal dose of radiation. He had the presence of mind to knock the brick off the core, which stopped the chain reaction, but the damage was done. He died 25 days later in the Los Alamos hospital at the age of 24. The exact same core was involved in a second accident 9 months later, almost to the day. On the 21st of May, 1946, a Canadian physicist named Louis Lawton was doing a different criticality experiment. This one involving the core being partially surrounded by two beryllium hemispheres. The hemispheres reflected neutrons more effectively than tungsten carbide, which made the experiment more sensitive but also more dangerous. The protocol, in theory, was to use shims to keep the two hemispheres apart and to lower the upper hemisphere very gradually onto the core. Slotin, however, had developed the habit of using a flathead screwdriver to hold the upper hemisphere up while bringing it close to the core with one hand. He had done this many times before. On this particular day, in front of 7 other people in the room, the screwdriver slipped. The two hemispheres came together. There was a bright blue flash of light, the result of ionizing radiation hitting the air molecules in the room. The core went prompt supercritical for a fraction of a second before Slotin, in one instinctive motion, knocked the upper hemisphere off and stopped the reaction. Slotin had received an estimated dose of about 10 sieverts of radiation, which is many times the lethal dose. He died 9 days later. The press release from Los Alamos at the time described his condition as, quote, three-dimensional sunburn, end quote, which is the most clinical and most unsettling way of describing acute radiation syndrome that I have ever come across. The other 7 people in the room received much smaller doses because Slotin's body had shielded them from a lot of the radiation. 4 of those 7 would eventually die from causes that may have been related to their exposure, though some lived into old age. After Slotin's death, criticality experiments at Los Alamos were halted. When they resumed, they were conducted remotely, with the operators about a quarter of a mile away from the actual experiment, controlling the apparatus through motors and cables. The era of, quote, hands-on, end quote, criticality experimentation was over. The core itself was nicknamed the Demon Core after the second accident because 2 physicists had now died handling it, and because at that point everyone in the laboratory was, understandably, kind of done with it. The plan had been to ship it to the Pacific for the Operation Crossroads nuclear weapons tests, but it was deemed too radioactive after the Slotin incident, and instead it was melted down and recycled into new warheads. So, somewhere in the inventory of the United States nuclear arsenal, or what is left of it, there is plutonium that used to be the Demon Core, and that has killed 2 people, which is a thing I think about sometimes. Okay, so let me get to the end of the war and the start of what comes next. By the end of 1945, the war was over. The United States had used 2 atomic bombs against Japan. The Soviet Union was working very hard on building its own bomb, and the Manhattan Project was being wound down and reorganized. The civilian agency that would eventually take over from the military, the Atomic Energy Commission, was created by the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, which transferred control of all nuclear research, materials, and weapons from the Army to a civilian board. The Commission's mission, on paper, was to promote both the military and the peaceful applications of nuclear energy, although in practice, for the next several years, almost all of the work was still about weapons. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in August of 1949, which came as a serious shock to the United States. The American intelligence estimates had assumed that the Soviets would not be able to build a bomb until at least the mid 1950s. The actual timeline was much shorter, partly because Soviet espionage had given them detailed information about the American designs, and partly because Soviet physicists were extremely capable in their own right. The British tested their own bomb in 1952. The French would test one in 1960, China in 1964, and so on down the line. The nuclear age very quickly became a global affair, which brings us to the peaceful applications of all of this. Through the late 1940s and the early 1950s, the United States government had been working in a relatively quiet way on figuring out whether nuclear energy could be used to generate electricity. There had been early experimental reactors that proved the concept, including the experimental breeder reactor 1 in Idaho, which on the 20th of December 1951 became the first reactor to generate electricity from nuclear power, just enough to light 4 light bulbs in the building. The Hanford reactors had been producing electricity as a side product since the war. The Naval Reactors Program, which I will get to in a moment, was developing reactors that could power submarines. But none of this was being done at any kind of commercial scale, and the technology was almost entirely controlled by the government, kept classified, and considered too sensitive to release. That started to change in 1953 when President Dwight Eisenhower gave a speech to the United Nations General Assembly on the 8th of December, which has come to be known as the Atoms for Peace speech. Eisenhower, who was a former general and who had been involved in the decisions to use the atomic bombs against Japan, was deeply uncomfortable with the direction the nuclear arms race was heading. He was looking for a way to repurpose the technology, or at least the public perception of it, away from weapons and towards peaceful uses. The speech was, in some sense, a propaganda exercise designed to reposition the United States as a peace-seeking nation rather than as the country that had unleashed atomic weapons on civilians. But it also genuinely committed the United States to sharing nuclear technology with other countries for peaceful purposes through a new international agency. The Atoms for Peace program, which followed the speech, did 3 main things. 1. It led to the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, in 1957, which is still the main international body overseeing nuclear technology today. 2. It relaxed the secrecy restrictions on nuclear technology, which allowed private American companies to start developing commercial nuclear power plants. And 3. It actively exported nuclear technology to other countries, including reactors, research equipment, and trained personnel. And here is a fact that I had to triple check before I would believe it. The first nuclear research reactors in Israel and in Pakistan, both of which would eventually develop into nuclear weapon states, were built by an American company called American Machine and Foundry. American Machine and Foundry was, in addition to being a nuclear contractor, primarily a manufacturer of bowling alley equipment. They made the pin setters and the ball returns and the rest of the gear that you would find in a bowling alley. And the same company, with no irony at all, was building research reactors for Israel and Pakistan in the late 1950s. There is a sentence in the Wikipedia article on Atoms for Peace that just sort of casually mentions this, and I had to read it 3 times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. The first nuclear reactors in Israel and Pakistan were built by, quote, a company more commonly known as a major manufacturer of bowling equipment, end quote, which is, in a small way, the perfect summary of how strange the atomic age was. Okay, so back to the main story. Even before the Atoms for Peace speech, the United States military had been working on a program that would, more or less by accident, end up shaping the entire civilian nuclear power industry. That program was the development of nuclear submarines, and the person who drove it, against significant institutional resistance, was a man named Hyman Rickover. Rickover was born in 1899 or possibly 1900, depending on which source you go with, in a small town in what is now Poland, but was then part of the Russian Empire. His family fled Russia when he was 6 years old to escape the pogroms that were affecting Jewish communities at the time, and they eventually settled in Chicago, where his father worked as a tailor. Rickover graduated from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1922, served on various ships, attended Columbia University for a master's degree in electrical engineering, and qualified for submarine duty. In 1929, he was, by basically every account, an extremely difficult person to work with. He was demanding, abrasive, frequently insubordinate, and absolutely uncompromising about engineering quality. He was also, it turned out, exactly the right person to drive a nuclear submarine program. After the war, in 1946, Rickover was sent to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, along with several other naval officers, to learn about nuclear energy. He became convinced almost immediately that nuclear-powered submarines were the future of submarine warfare. The advantages were obvious. A conventional diesel-electric submarine had to surface every 12 to 48 hours to recharge its batteries, which required running its diesel engines, which required oxygen, which is why submarines had to come up. A nuclear submarine, by contrast, did not need air at all, because nuclear fission does not require oxygen. It could stay submerged for weeks or even months, limited only by food and crew morale. It could also go much faster underwater and operate at much greater depths than any diesel boat. The strategic implications were enormous. The problem was that the Navy bureaucracy at the time, was not particularly interested in nuclear submarines. The senior officers were primarily interested in surface ships and aircraft carriers, and a lot of them viewed the nuclear submarine idea as a kind of science fiction fantasy. Rickover, who was a captain at the time and had no particular institutional power, had to fight, basically constantly, to get the program funded and supported. He went around his superiors and made his case directly to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Chester Nimitz, and to the Secretary of the Navy. He cultivated relationships with members of Congress. He was passed over for promotion to admiral twice by the Navy's promotion board, which would have forced him into mandatory retirement under the up or out rules. But each time, congressional intervention saved his career. He was eventually promoted to admiral in 1953, and he kept his job, but it was a long and ugly fight. While all this was going on, the actual nuclear submarine was being designed and built. The reactor for the first submarine, the USS Nautilus, was a pressurized water reactor developed by Westinghouse Electric, which had been chosen as the primary contractor. The reactor design was tested on land first at a prototype facility called STR Mark I in Idaho, which went critical in March of 1953. The submarine itself was built by the Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics in Groton, Connecticut. Its keel was laid by President Harry Truman in June of 1952. The Nautilus was launched on the 21st of January 1954, with Mamie Eisenhower, the wife of the president, breaking a bottle of champagne across the bow. It was commissioned into service on the 30th of September 1954, and on the 17th of January 1955, it cast off from the pier at Groton, headed down the Thames River, and sent a famous signal back to its escort tug, which read, "Underway on nuclear power," which was the first time in human history that any vehicle had moved under nuclear propulsion. The Nautilus would go on to set basically every submarine record there was. It made the longest submerged voyage in history, traveling almost 1,400 miles fully submerged. It became the first submarine to pass under the geographic North Pole in August of 1958. And more importantly, for the wider story, it proved that the pressurized water reactor design was reliable enough, safe enough, and compact enough to be used in practical applications outside of weapons production. Rickover, by the way, kept being Rickover. He personally interviewed every officer who was being considered for the nuclear submarine program for decades, and he turned the interviews into a kind of stress test. He would do things like make a candidate sit in a chair where one of the front legs had been sawed shorter than the others, so the candidate had to constantly adjust to keep from falling over, just to see how they handled discomfort. He would ask them ridiculous personal questions to see how they would respond under pressure. He interviewed, by some estimates, more than 14,000 officers over the course of his career. He was also the only person in modern American military history to have served on active duty for 63 years. He was forced into retirement in 1982 at the age of 82 after serving under 13 presidents. He was also, more or less single-handedly, responsible for the safety culture of the United States Navy nuclear program, which has, in roughly 70 years of operation, never had a single nuclear accident involving a reactor on any naval vessel. Not one. The United States Navy currently operates around 80 nuclear-powered vessels, including all of its aircraft carriers and all of its submarines, and the entire fleet has a perfect safety record when it comes to reactor accidents, despite the fact that some of these reactors are operated within feet of crew members for years at a time. That track record is, more than anything else, a direct result of the standards that Rickover imposed. And here is the other thing about Rickover that I find genuinely interesting, which is that the entire civilian nuclear power industry in the United States ended up being built more or less around the technology that Rickover developed for submarines. When the Atomic Energy Commission decided to push for a civilian nuclear power plant, they basically took the Westinghouse pressurized water reactor design from the canceled aircraft carrier reactor program and scaled it up to commercial size. The result was the Shippingport Atomic Power Station in Pennsylvania, which went critical in 1957 and started supplying electricity to the city of Pittsburgh in late 1957. It was the first full-scale civilian nuclear power plant in the United States, and it was basically a submarine reactor with the submarine removed and an electric generator attached. The lineage of almost every commercial nuclear plant in the United States and a lot of the ones elsewhere in the world goes back through Shippingport, back through Rickover's submarine program, back to the original prototype in Idaho. The civilian nuclear power industry was, in a real way, the side product of a naval weapons project. Now, the Soviet Union had beaten the United States to the punch on civilian nuclear power. The first nuclear power plant in the world to be connected to a national electrical grid was the Obninsk Atomic Power Station in the town of Obninsk, about 60 miles southwest of Moscow. It went critical on the 9th of May, 1954, and started supplying electricity to the grid on the 27th of June of that same year. It had a capacity of about 5 megawatts of electrical power, which is tiny by modern standards. It used a graphite moderated water-cooled reactor design that would eventually evolve several decades later into the much larger and much more troubled RBMK reactors that we will get to in a bit. The Obninsk plant operated for 48 years until it was finally shut down in 2002, and the building is now preserved as a museum and a monument. So, in the strange chronology of these things, the Soviet Union had the first grid-connected civilian nuclear power plant. The United States had the first full-scale commercial nuclear power plant, and the United Kingdom, between them, had the first industrial-scale nuclear plant at Calder Hall, which started in 1956 and was technically a dual-purpose facility producing both electricity and plutonium for the British nuclear weapons program. Okay, so let me actually talk about how a nuclear reactor works, because we have been throwing around the word reactor a lot without going into too much detail, and the actual mechanics are kind of cool, even if the basic principles are pretty simple. So, at the heart of any nuclear reactor is the fuel, which in basically all commercial reactors is uranium. Uranium occurs naturally on Earth in two main forms, or isotopes, which are uranium-238 and uranium-235. The numbers refer to the total number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus. Uranium-238 has 92 protons and 146 neutrons, for a total of 238. Uranium-235 has 92 protons and 143 neutrons. The protons number is the same because that is what makes them both uranium. The neutrons are different. The reason this matters is that uranium-235 is fissile, which means it can sustain a chain reaction when bombarded with slow neutrons. Uranium-238 is not fissile under normal conditions. And in natural uranium, as it is mined out of the ground, only about 0.7% of the uranium is the fissile 235 isotope. The rest, about 99.3%, is the 238 isotope. To make uranium useful as reactor fuel, you have to enrich it, which means increasing the proportion of 235. For commercial power reactors, this typically means enriching to between 3 and 5% uranium, 235. For nuclear weapons, it has to be enriched to about 90% or more, which is much harder and is one of the main bottlenecks on weapons proliferation. Once you have enriched uranium, it gets processed into small ceramic pellets, each one about the size of an eraser on a pencil. These pellets are loaded into long metal tubes called fuel rods, which are typically made of zirconium alloy because zirconium has a very low neutron absorption cross-section, meaning it does not soak up neutrons that you would rather have hitting other uranium atoms. The fuel rods are then bundled together into fuel assemblies, which are basically rectangular arrays of these rods, with maybe a couple of hundred rods in each assembly. The fuel assemblies are then loaded into the reactor core, which is the central part of the reactor where the chain reaction happens. A typical commercial reactor core contains anywhere from 150 to 250 fuel assemblies, depending on the size and design. Now, the fuel rods alone will not sustain a chain reaction. The neutrons being given off by fission are very fast, way too fast, to be efficiently absorbed by other uranium-235 nuclei. You need to slow them down. This is the job of the moderator, which is a material that the fast neutrons bounce off of, losing energy each time until they slow down to thermal energy, which is the same energy as the surrounding molecules at the temperature of the reactor. In most commercial reactors, the moderator is just ordinary water. Water contains a lot of hydrogen, and hydrogen nuclei, which are just protons, are very effective at slowing down neutrons because they are about the same mass as a neutron. Other reactors use heavy water, which is water with deuterium instead of hydrogen, or graphite, which is pure carbon, as the moderator. The water also plays a second role, which is that it acts as the coolant. The chain reaction generates heat, a lot of heat, and that heat has to be carried away from the core, both to prevent the fuel rods from melting and to do useful work like generating electricity. In a pressurized water reactor, which is the most common design, the water in the core is kept at very high pressure, around 15 million pascals, which is about 150 times atmospheric pressure. The pressure prevents the water from boiling even though it is at a temperature of more than 300 degrees Celsius. This hot pressurized water is then pumped through a heat exchanger where it heats a second loop of water which boils into steam. The steam then spins a turbine, which spins a generator, which produces electricity. It is, when you strip it all down, a steam engine. The nuclear reaction is just a really, really hot heat source. To control the rate of the reaction, the reactor has control rods, which are made of materials that absorb neutrons, like boron or cadmium or hafnium. The control rods can be inserted into the core to absorb neutrons and slow down the reaction, or withdrawn to let more neutrons cause more fission and speed up the reaction. By moving the control rods up and down, the operators can adjust the reactor's power output, just like the throttle on an engine. And in an emergency, the control rods can be dropped fully into the core, which is called a scram, and which will shut down the chain reaction within seconds. The word scram, by the way, comes from the early days at Chicago Pile 1, where the safety control rod was suspended above the pile on a rope, and there was supposedly a guy with an axe standing by whose job was to cut the rope if anything went wrong, releasing the rod into the pile and stopping the reaction. The axeman was supposedly called the Safety Control Rod Axeman, abbreviated SCRAM. Whether this is the actual origin of the term, or whether it is a folk etymology that got attached after the fact, depends on which source you believe. The whole reactor core with the fuel, the moderator, the coolant, and the control rods is housed inside a reactor pressure vessel, which is a very thick steel container, often 8 to 12 inches thick. That pressure vessel is housed inside a containment building which is typically made of reinforced concrete several feet thick, designed to withstand basically anything that could happen inside the reactor, including a complete core meltdown without releasing radioactive material to the outside. The containment building is one of the most important safety features of any commercial reactor, and the lack of one is, for example, one of the reasons the Chernobyl accident was as bad as it was. But we will get to that. There are a few main types of reactors that are in use around the world today. The pressurized water reactor, which I just described, is the most common, accounting for about 65% of commercial reactors. The other major light water reactor design is the boiling water reactor, in which the water in the reactor core is allowed to boil directly, and the steam from the core goes straight to the turbines without a heat exchanger. This is a simpler design with fewer components, but it has the disadvantage that the steam in the turbines is mildly radioactive, which makes maintenance more complicated. The Fukushima Daiichi reactors, which we will get to, were boiling water reactors. There are also several less common designs. The pressurized heavy water reactor, sometimes called CANDU after the Canadian variant, uses heavy water as the moderator, which is much better at not absorbing neutrons than ordinary water, and which means the reactor can run on natural unenriched uranium. This is a big advantage for countries that do not have access to enrichment facilities. There are gas-cooled reactors, which use a gas, usually helium or carbon dioxide, as the coolant and graphite as the moderator. The British built a lot of these in the 1950s and 60s, and some of them are still operating. There are fast neutron reactors, which do not use a moderator at all, and which can be used to breed plutonium from uranium-238. The Russians have one in operation, the BN-800 at the Beloyarsk plant. And then there is the RBMK reactor, which is the design used at Chernobyl, and which is, by basically every account, kind of a strange design. RBMK stands for Reactor Bolshoi Moshnosti Kanalny, which translates to high-power channel-type reactor. It is a graphite moderated water-cooled reactor, which means the moderator is graphite and the coolant is water, which is an unusual combination. The reactor is built as a grid of vertical channels in a graphite block, with fuel rods inserted into each channel and water flowing through them. The advantage of this design is that it can be refueled while running, which is convenient for producing plutonium for weapons, which is one of the reasons the Soviet Union built it. The disadvantage, which we will get to in detail, is that under certain operating conditions, it has what is called a positive void coefficient, which means that if the cooling water boils into steam, the reaction speeds up rather than slowing down, which is the opposite of what you want in a reactor. The RBMK was never built outside of the Soviet Union because basically nobody else thought it was a good idea. The Western designs, in particular the pressurized water reactor and the boiling water reactor, all have negative void coefficients, which means that if anything goes wrong with the cooling, the reaction tends to shut itself down rather than speed up. The RBMK was kept on the Soviet side of the Iron Curtain partly for security reasons, because of its potential use for plutonium production, and partly because the Western nuclear establishment basically rejected it on safety grounds. The choice to use it inside the Soviet Union was driven by cost. The RBMK was cheaper to build than the alternative VVER design, which was a pressurized water reactor, and the Soviet planners prioritized cost over safety in a way that would eventually become very expensive. So, with all of that as background, let me talk about the accidents, because there have been several serious nuclear accidents in the history of the technology, and they each tell a different story, and they each had different consequences. And I want to go through them roughly in chronological order, starting with one that, until the 1980s, almost nobody in the West had even heard of, because the Soviet Union had kept it classified for 30 years. That accident is called the Kishtim disaster, and it happened in 1957 in a closed Soviet nuclear weapons facility in the southern Urals. The site of the accident was the Mayak Production Association, which was the main Soviet plutonium production facility located near the city of Ozersk, in what was then the closed industrial city of Chelyabinsk 40, and which is sometimes referred to in older sources by the name of the nearest town the Soviets would acknowledge, which was Kishtim. The facility had been built rapidly in the late 1940s in the rush to produce plutonium for the Soviet nuclear weapons program, and the early years of its operation were, to put it mildly, careless about radioactive waste disposal. Tons of high-level liquid waste, including various fission products and dissolved actinides, were stored in underground tanks at the site. The tanks were cooled by a cooling system that, in 1957, had been broken for some time without being repaired, because nobody had really noticed. On the 29th of September 1957, one of these tanks, containing about 70 to 80 tons of liquid high-level waste, overheated. As the residual heat from the fission products inside had no way to escape, the contents, which included nitrate compounds, dried out, and then the dry chemical mixture spontaneously ignited and exploded. The explosion, which had a yield of roughly 70 to 100 tons of TNT equivalent, blew the concrete lid off the tank, dispersed the radioactive contents over a wide area, and created a radioactive plume that spread northeast for hundreds of miles, contaminating an area of roughly 20,000 square kilometers and exposing an estimated 270,000 people to elevated radiation doses. About 10,000 people were eventually evacuated from the most heavily contaminated areas. Although the evacuation took place gradually over a couple of years, and many of the evacuees were not told what they were being evacuated from. The death toll from the accident is hard to estimate, partly because the Soviet authorities classified all of the medical records for decades, but estimates range from several hundred to several thousand long-term deaths. The Soviet government did not officially acknowledge the accident until 1989, more than 30 years after it happened. Western intelligence services had figured out that something had happened at Mayak from satellite imagery and from emigre reports, but the details were not publicly confirmed until after Soviet authorities released the information themselves. The contaminated zone, which is called the East Urals radioactive trace, is still in place today, and parts of it are still off limits. The Kishtim disaster is rated as a level 6 accident on the International Nuclear Event Scale, which makes it the third worst nuclear accident in history after Chernobyl and Fukushima, even though most people have never heard of it. The reason it has been forgotten is essentially that the Soviet Union was very good at keeping secrets, and the West did not really have much incentive to publicize it after the Cold War ended. There is also, from this period, a smaller but extremely strange story called the Goiânia accident, which happened in Brazil in 1987, and which I think is worth telling because it is one of the more horrifying examples of what can happen when radioactive materials are not properly controlled. In the city of Goiânia, in central Brazil, there was a private radiotherapy clinic called the Instituto Goiano de Radioterapia, which had used a small medical device that contained a source of cesium 137, a strongly radioactive isotope used in cancer treatment. The clinic had relocated in 1985, but had left the old device partially disassembled in the abandoned building. The building itself was in disrepair and was not properly secured. In September of 1987, two local men who collected scrap metal broke into the abandoned clinic, found the device, and managed to remove the radioactive source assembly from it. They took it home, partially disassembled it further, and discovered that the inside of the device contained a small amount of a blue glowing powder, which was the cesium chloride that contained the radioactive cesium. They had no idea what it was. They thought it was beautiful. They started showing it to friends and family members. People rubbed it on their skin. Children played with it. A small girl, who was the 6-year-old niece of one of the scrap dealers, took a piece of it and ate the powder mixed with a sandwich because she liked how it sparkled. Within about 2 weeks, 4 people had died from acute radiation syndrome. About 250 people in total were contaminated. The cleanup of the affected areas of Goiânia involved removing topsoil from several houses, demolishing the houses themselves, and disposing of the contaminated material in a specially constructed concrete vault. The little girl who had eaten the powder died, and her funeral had to be conducted with her body in a lead-lined coffin because her remains were so radioactive. There was rioting outside the cemetery by people who did not want her buried there because they were afraid the radioactivity would contaminate the local groundwater, even though it would not have, because she was already sealed in lead. The Goiânia accident led to significant changes in how radioactive medical equipment is tracked and disposed of, both in Brazil and internationally. The International Atomic Energy Agency now maintains a database of orphaned radioactive sources, which are radioactive materials that have escaped from proper regulatory control, and there are coordinated international efforts to recover them when they are found. The Goiânia accident is rated as a level 5 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, which makes it less severe than the major reactor accidents, but it is, in some ways, more disturbing because the cause was so banal. Two guys looking for scrap metal, opening a box, finding something that glowed blue, and not knowing what they had. Okay, so back to reactor accidents. The other one I want to talk about, which does not get nearly enough attention. SL1 was a small experimental reactor at the National Reactor Testing Station in eastern Idaho, which is now called the Idaho National Laboratory. The testing station was, in the 1950s and 60s, a sort of nuclear theme park where various government agencies and contractors built and tested all kinds of experimental reactors. The site is in the high desert about 40 miles west of Idaho Falls, in a basically empty stretch of land, and at one point there were over 50 different test reactors operating at the site. SL1 stood for Stationary Low Power Reactor Number 1, and it was a prototype for a series of small reactors that the United States Army wanted to use to power remote radar stations in the Arctic along the distant Early Warning Line, which was a chain of radar stations across the far north of Canada and Alaska that was supposed to detect Soviet bombers coming over the pole. The Army wanted reactors that were small, lightweight, easy to operate, and could run for long periods without refueling, because resupplying a radar station in the Arctic was incredibly expensive. SL1 was designed to produce 3 megawatts of thermal power, of which about 200 kilowatts would be turned into electricity, with the rest used for heating the radar station. The design was very simple. It was a small boiling water reactor with a single big central control rod that was thicker than the others, plus 8 smaller peripheral rods. The simplicity was a feature, not a bug. The whole point was that you should be able to operate it with a small crew of military technicians who did not need extensive nuclear training. The reactor went into service in 1958, and it operated more or less without incident until the 3rd of January, 1961. On that day, 3 military operators, a Navy electrician named Richard Legg, an Army specialist named John Burns, and another Army specialist named Richard McKinley, were on shift to restart the reactor after an 11-day maintenance shutdown over the New Year holiday. The first step in the restart procedure was to reconnect the central control rod to its drive mechanism, which had been disconnected for maintenance and which involved manually lifting the rod by about 4 inches to reconnect it. 80 pounds of rod lifted 4 inches by hand. Nothing weird about that. What happened next is technically still not completely clear because all 3 men died. The investigators reconstructed events from the physical evidence afterwards. What they figured out was this. Instead of lifting the central rod about 4 inches, somebody, almost certainly Burns, who was the operator, lifted it about 20 inches. That was way too far. It pushed the reactor from a shutdown state straight into prompt criticality, which means a chain reaction that grows faster than the delayed neutrons can keep up with. The power level of the reactor jumped from essentially zero to about 20 gigawatts within 4 milliseconds. 20 gigawatts from off in 4 thousandths of a second. The intense heat from this power excursion vaporized some of the water in the reactor vessel and created a steam explosion. The water column above the core, weighing thousands of pounds, was driven upward at about 160 feet per second, hitting the top of the reactor vessel with a force of about 10,000 pounds per square inch. The entire reactor vessel, weighing about 35,000 pounds, was lifted 9 feet straight up off its foundation. The supervisor, who had been standing on top of the reactor lid, was impaled by an expelled shield plug and pinned to the ceiling of the reactor building. The other 2 operators were killed by the blast or by the radiation almost instantly. When the alarm went off and the first responders arrived, they did not initially realize that anything serious had happened. The exterior of the reactor building looked normal. There had been a couple of false alarms earlier in the day, so they were inclined to be skeptical. But when they entered the building, their radiation detectors immediately spiked. The level of radiation inside was so high that they could only work in shifts of about 65 seconds, rotating in and out of the building to limit their own exposure. It took them a while to find all 3 bodies, partly because one of them was pinned to the ceiling. When they eventually recovered the bodies, they had to be sealed in lead-lined caskets, and some highly radioactive body parts were buried separately as radioactive waste in the Idaho desert. There's no other way to put that. The families did not get the complete remains. The investigation that followed concluded that the accident was caused by the operator pulling the central control rod way too far, way too fast, although the exact reason he did this has never been established. There were theories about it being an accident, about it being a suicide, about it being some kind of bizarre attempt at a murder-suicide involving a love triangle, although none of these theories were ever proven. The technical conclusion was that the reactor design had an inherent flaw, which was that any single control rod, if fully withdrawn, could cause a critical excursion all by itself. Modern reactor designs require multiple control rods to be withdrawn, so that a single mistake cannot cause an accident. The SL1 design was, in a way, asking for trouble, and it got it. SL1 is, to this day, the only fatal reactor accident in American history. The Army nuclear power program was effectively killed by the accident, and the project to build small reactors for the DEW line was cancelled. The site of the reactor was decontaminated, and the contaminated equipment was buried at a special waste site at the National Reactor Testing Station, which was officially opened in May of 1961, specifically for this purpose. The three operators were buried in lead-lined caskets, sealed with concrete, and placed in metal vaults, also lined with concrete. They received full military honors. Okay, so now let me jump forward to the next big one, which is 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island is the most famous nuclear accident in American history, even though, in retrospect, the actual radiation release was tiny and nobody died as a direct result of it. But the political and cultural impact was enormous. 3 Mile Island, more than anything else, is what killed the American nuclear power industry for almost 40 years. The 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station was a 2-reactor commercial nuclear power plant on a sandbar in the Susquehanna River, about 10 miles downstream from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was operated by Metropolitan Edison, a regional utility company. The 2 reactors were both pressurized water reactors made by Babcock and Wilcox. Unit 1 had been operating since 1974 and was, at the time of the accident, one of the best performing reactors in the country. Unit 2 had only been operating commercially for about 3 months when the accident happened. It was, in nuclear terms, basically brand new. The accident started at 4 in the morning on the 28th of March, 1979. The initial cause was a routine equipment failure in the secondary cooling loop, which was the non-nuclear part of the plant. The feed water pumps stopped working. This was the kind of thing that nuclear plants are designed to handle. Backup pumps automatically started up, the reactor automatically shut down, the system was supposed to recover. The problem was that several things then went wrong, in sequence, in a way that the operators did not understand at the time. The first thing that went wrong was that a pressure relief valve at the top of the reactor pressure vessel opened as it was supposed to release some of the rising pressure. But when the pressure dropped, the valve was supposed to close again, and it did not. It stuck open. Coolant water was now leaking out of the reactor at a steady rate. The indicator on the control panel showed that the valve had been commanded to close, which the operators interpreted as meaning the valve had actually closed, but it had not. The valve was stuck. They did not know this for several hours. The second thing that went wrong was that the emergency cooling system, which was designed to automatically inject water into the reactor in the event of a loss of coolant, did kick in as it was supposed to. But the operators, looking at their gauges, thought the reactor had too much water in it, not too little. The gauge they were reading was a level in the pressurizer, which is a tank that maintains the pressure in the primary loop. The pressurizer was showing a high level. The operators interpreted this as the reactor being too full, and they shut off the emergency cooling system. In reality, the reactor was losing water through the stuck open valve, and the pressurizer level was high because the steam coming out of the leak was pushing the water level up artificially. By turning off the emergency cooling, the operators basically eliminated their lost safety system. The third thing that went wrong was that nobody, for several hours, figured out what was actually happening. The control room indicators were all showing various warning lights, but the operators were getting more than 100 alarms simultaneously, and there was no good way to prioritize them. The control room itself, by modern standards, was a kind of human factors disaster. The indicators were laid out in a confusing way. The alarm system was overwhelmed, and the operators had not been trained to deal with this specific kind of multi-failure scenario. So while the reactor was losing coolant water and the core was beginning to overheat, the operators were trying to figure out what was happening, and they were getting it wrong. By about 6 in the morning, the upper portion of the reactor core had become uncovered, which means the water level had dropped below the top of the fuel assemblies. The exposed fuel began to overheat. The zirconium cladding around the fuel rods reacted with steam to produce hydrogen gas, which collected at the top of the reactor vessel. The fuel temperature got high enough that about 45% of the core melted, with about 19 tons of molten fuel pooling at the bottom of the reactor vessel. This is technically a partial meltdown. The fuel had melted, but the reactor pressure vessel, which is very thick steel, held. The containment building, which is much thicker reinforced concrete, also held. Almost all of the radioactive material was kept inside. The thing that turned this from a serious accident into a national panic was the hydrogen bubble. The hydrogen gas that had collected at the top of the reactor vessel was, according to some early analyses, potentially explosive. There were concerns that if it ignited, it could rupture the reactor vessel and possibly the containment building, releasing a huge amount of radioactive material into the surrounding area. For several days, this was a serious worry. The governor of Pennsylvania, Dick Thornburg, recommended that pregnant women and preschool children evacuate from a 5-mile zone around the plant. Within days, more than 140,000 people had left the area. The news media reported the story basically 24 hours a day, in a way that they had not really covered any previous engineering accident. President Jimmy Carter, who happened to have a background in nuclear engineering from his time in the Navy, visited the plant in person to try to calm public concern. Eventually, the hydrogen bubble was determined to be much less dangerous than initially thought, because the conditions in the reactor vessel did not have enough oxygen for the hydrogen to actually ignite. The bubble was gradually vented over several days. The reactor was stabilized and the immediate crisis ended. The actual amount of radioactive material released to the environment was very small. The Kemeny Commission, which was appointed by President Carter to investigate the accident, concluded that the average dose to people within a 10-mile radius was about 8 millirems, which is roughly equivalent to a chest X-ray. The maximum dose to anyone was estimated at about 100 millirems, which is comparable to the natural background radiation you would receive from living in Denver, Colorado for a year. Multiple epidemiological studies have looked at cancer rates in the area around 3 Mile Island in the decades since, and they have not found any detectable increase in cancer or other health effects that can be attributed to the accident. But the political and economic consequences were enormous. Within a few months of the accident, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission imposed a moratorium on new reactor licenses. Many planned nuclear projects were canceled. Public support for nuclear power, which had been declining through the 1970s, basically collapsed. Between 1979 and the early 2000s, almost no new nuclear plants were ordered in the United States, although some that had already been started before the accident were eventually completed. The American nuclear industry, which had been growing rapidly through the 1960s and 70s, basically froze for almost 40 years. And 3 Mile Island, more than anything else, is the reason. Unit 2 at 3 Mile Island, the one that melted down, was never restarted. It took about 14 years and roughly $1 billion to clean up the damaged reactor in an operation that involved sending robotic cameras into the core, removing the molten fuel piece by piece, and shipping the radioactive debris to a facility in Idaho for storage. Unit 1, the undamaged reactor, was eventually restarted in 1985 and continued to operate as one of the most reliable nuclear plants in the country until it was shut down in 2019 for economic reasons. The site is now in the process of being fully decommissioned, although there have been some discussions as of 2023 about restarting Unit 1 to provide power to data centers operated by various technology companies. So 3 Mile Island was bad, but it was not the worst nuclear accident. That, of course, was Chernobyl, which happened 7 years later in 1986, and which is, by basically every measure, one of the worst industrial accidents of all time. So let me tell that story properly, because there is a lot of misinformation about it. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was located in northern Ukraine, about 60 miles north of Kyiv, near the abandoned city of Pripyat. It had 4 operating RBMK reactors, with 2 more under construction. The RBMK design, which I described earlier, was the high-power channel reactor with a graphite moderator and water coolant, and it had several known design problems, including the positive void coefficient and a control rod design that, in certain conditions, could actually cause a brief power spike when the rods were inserted. These problems were known to the Soviet nuclear establishment, but they had not been communicated to the operators at the plants, partly because the information was classified. On the 25th of April, 1986, the operators at Chernobyl Reactor 4 were preparing to perform a safety test ahead of a scheduled maintenance shutdown. The test was designed to verify that if the plant lost external electrical power, the rotational momentum of the spinning turbines could provide enough electrical power to run the emergency cooling pumps for the 30 or 40 seconds it would take for the backup diesel generators to come online. It was, in principle, a sensible test. Several similar tests had been done on this and other reactors before. The test required the reactor to be operating at low power, but not too low, with various safety systems disabled to prevent them from interfering with the test conditions. The test was delayed for about 10 hours due to a request from the regional grid controller who needed Chernobyl 4 to keep producing power during peak demand. By the time the operators were given permission to proceed, the day shift had ended and the night shift had taken over. The night shift was less experienced, and they had not been briefed in detail about the test procedure. Worse, while the reactor was being kept at low power waiting for permission to start the test, a buildup of xenon, which is a fission product that absorbs neutrons, had occurred in the core. Xenon is what nuclear engineers call a reactor poison because it absorbs neutrons and makes it harder to sustain the chain reaction. The standard practice when this happens is to shut down the reactor and let the xenon decay away over a day or so, and then start back up. The operators, who were under pressure to complete the test, instead decided to keep the reactor running by withdrawing more of the control rods to compensate for the xenon poisoning. This put the reactor in a condition that the operating procedures said was strictly forbidden. With most of the control rods withdrawn, the reactor had no margin of safety left. If anything went wrong, there was no way to quickly bring it under control because the rods would take too long to be reinserted. But the operators did not know how close to the edge they were because the design flaws of the RBMK had not been fully communicated to them. At 1:23 in the morning on the 26th of April, 1986, the operators started the test. They closed the steam valves to the turbines, which caused the turbines to begin slowing down. As the turbines slowed, the power to the cooling pumps dropped and less water was being pumped through the reactor core. The water in the core began to boil, creating steam voids. And because of the positive void coefficients, this caused the reactor power to start increasing rather than decreasing. The operator saw what was happening and pressed the emergency shutdown button, the AZ5 button, which was supposed to drop all of the control rods into the core and shut down the reaction. But here is the design flaw that mattered most. The control rods on the RBMK had graphite tips on the bottom. Graphite, which is a moderator, actually displaces water in the reactor and briefly increases the rate of reaction before the boron part of the rod reaches the active zone. So when the AZ5 button was pressed, instead of immediately shutting down the reactor, the rods first caused a brief power spike as the graphite tips entered the core and displaced the water. In a reactor that was already on the edge of running away, this was the worst possible thing that could have happened. The power level of the reactor, which was supposed to be around 200 megawatts during the test, spiked to an estimated 30,000 megawatts, which is about 10 times the reactor's normal full power output within a fraction of a second. The fuel rods overheated, vaporized, and ruptured. Their fragments hit the cooling water, causing it to flash into steam, which caused a massive steam explosion that lifted the 2,000-ton reactor lid off the top of the reactor and tilted it on its side. A second explosion, which is sometimes interpreted as a hydrogen explosion caused by the zirconium cladding reacting with steam, but which some analyses suggest may have been a small nuclear explosion involving prompt criticality of fragments of the fuel, followed a couple of seconds later. The roof of the reactor building was blown off. Burning fragments of graphite and fuel were ejected into the air, falling onto the roof of the adjacent reactor building and onto the surrounding grounds. The reactor core itself was now exposed to the open air. 2 plant workers were killed by the initial explosion. The fires that started on the roof of the reactor building were tackled by firefighters from Pripyat and other nearby towns, who were the first to respond. Most of the firefighters had no idea what they were dealing with. They had been trained to fight industrial fires, not nuclear accidents. They climbed onto the roof of the reactor building in basic firefighting gear, without any kind of radiation protection, and they fought the fires while standing on top of pieces of nuclear fuel and graphite that had been ejected from the reactor. Many of them received doses of radiation that were quickly fatal. 28 firefighters and plant workers died from acute radiation syndrome within the first few weeks after the accident. The Soviet response to the accident in the first few days was a mix of paralysis and secrecy. The plant managers initially refused to believe that the reactor core had been destroyed, despite the fact that one of the operators had actually gone up onto the roof and seen the open core glowing. The local authorities did not begin evacuating Pripyat until almost 36 hours after the accident. The Soviet central government was not officially informed until many hours after the explosion, and they did not announce the accident publicly until 2 days later, after radiation monitoring stations in Sweden picked up elevated levels and forced the Soviets to admit what had happened. The full scale of the disaster was kept secret for years. Over the days and weeks that followed, the response involved more than 500,000 people who were collectively called liquidators. They came from all over the Soviet Union: military reservists, miners, engineers, scientists, ordinary workers. They built a temporary concrete structure called the sarcophagus over the destroyed reactor to contain the remaining radioactive material. They removed contaminated debris from the surrounding area. They evacuated and decontaminated the surrounding villages. They worked in shifts of just a few minutes at a time in the most radioactive areas because that was the maximum dose anyone could safely receive. Many of them, especially the ones who worked closest to the reactor in the first weeks, received doses that would later cause health problems. The first major intervention in the first days after the accident was a series of helicopter drops over the open reactor core. Soviet military helicopters, mostly Mi-6 and Mi-26 transport helicopters, were used to drop a mixture of sand, lead, boron, dolomite, and clay into the burning core in an attempt to smother the graphite fire and absorb neutrons. The helicopters flew at very low altitudes over the open reactor, with crews opening the cargo doors and pushing the bags of material out by hand. Each pass took the crew through an extremely high radiation field. Over the course of about 10 days, roughly 5,000 tons of material were dropped onto the reactor by helicopter. The pilots and their crews received very high doses of radiation. At least one helicopter crashed during the operation on the 2nd of October 1986 when it struck a construction crane that had been used in the building of the sarcophagus. 4 crew members were killed. The footage of that crash is sometimes shown in documentaries, with the helicopter spinning down toward the ruins of the reactor in a way that is hard to watch. Then there were the miners, which is one of the lesser known aspects of the cleanup. After the bubbler pool was drained by the 3 divers, there was still a serious concern that the molten reactor core, which was still very hot and was estimated to still be melting downward, would eventually reach the groundwater underneath the plant and contaminate the aquifer that fed into the Dnieper River, which was the water supply for several million people. To prevent this, the Soviet government dispatched about 400 coal miners, roughly half from the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine and roughly half from the Tula region in Russia, to dig a tunnel underneath the reactor and install a heat exchanger and a thick concrete pad to absorb the molten material before it could reach the groundwater. The miners worked in temperatures of about 50 degrees Celsius in tunnels with very high radiation levels, in shifts of just a few hours at a time for about a month and a half. They were not given any protective equipment beyond their normal mining gear, partly because the standard radiation suits were too bulky for the cramped tunnels, and partly because, as some of the miners later said in interviews, nobody really thought to provide them. They completed the tunnel, which was about 150 meters long, and installed the equipment, although in the end, the molten fuel did not actually melt through the basement, and the heat exchanger was never used. A significant number of those miners died young from various causes that were probably related to their exposure, although the exact number is hard to determine. And then there is the strange, ongoing story of the babushkas of Chernobyl, which is something that I keep finding myself thinking about. After the evacuation of Pripyat and the surrounding villages, several hundred elderly women, mostly farmers in their 60s and 70s, refused to leave their ancestral homes inside the exclusion zone. The Soviet authorities, faced with the choice of forcibly removing them or letting them stay, mostly chose to let them stay on the grounds that they were old enough, that the long-term radiation effects would probably not affect them as much as a younger person, and that they were too set in their ways to relocate. Roughly 1,200 of these women initially returned to their villages inside the zone, and as of recent reports, about 100 to 200 are still living there in their original homes, eating food grown in the contaminated soil, drinking water from contaminated wells, and living, by basically every account, longer and healthier lives than the people who were relocated to high rise apartments in unfamiliar cities. There have been documentaries made about them. They are, in a way, the last permanent residents of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, although their numbers are slowly declining as they age. The Ukrainian authorities have, since the 1990s, basically tolerated their presence and have provided some basic services to them, including occasional bread deliveries and medical visits. They are, depending on how you look at it, either an example of human stubbornness winning out over a catastrophe, or evidence that low level chronic radiation exposure is much less harmful than people sometimes assume. Probably both. And then there is the story of the helicopter drops to seed clouds, which is something I had no idea about until I came across it in the research. The Soviet authorities, in the weeks after the accident, were extremely concerned about the radioactive plume reaching major cities, particularly Moscow. So they deployed cloud seeding aircraft to deliberately cause rain over Belarus in order to bring the radioactive particles down out of the clouds before they could reach the Russian population centers. The result was that significant amounts of radioactive material ended up deposited on Belarus, which has had ongoing health and agricultural consequences for that country, while Moscow was spared. This was, in some sense, a calculated political decision to protect the Soviet capital at the expense of a peripheral republic, and it is one of the things that Belarusians, in particular, still hold against the Soviet authorities. The exact details of the cloud seeding operations were classified for decades and only became public in the early 2000s. And then there is the story of the divers, which is one of the more memorable parts of the whole disaster. About a week after the initial explosion, there was a concern that the molten fuel from the reactor, which was eating its way down through the floor of the reactor building, was going to reach the bubbler pool, which was a large reservoir of water in the basement directly underneath the reactor. The bubbler pool was part of the cooling system. The molten fuel hitting the water would have caused a massive steam explosion, which would have blown more radioactive material into the atmosphere and possibly destroyed the nearby reactors as well. The estimated consequences of this second explosion would have been catastrophic for much of Europe. The only way to prevent this was to drain the bubbler pool by manually opening two valves located in the basement. The problem was that the basement was flooded with radioactive water, and you had to wade through it to reach the valves. 3 plant workers volunteered for the mission. Their names were Alexei Ananenko, who was a mechanical engineer, Valery Bezbalov, who was a senior engineer, and Boris Baranov, who was a shift supervisor. They put on diving suits and respirators, and they went down into the basement carrying flashlights. The flashlights kept dimming because the radioactivity was interfering with the batteries. They found the valves, which were labeled in a way that they could identify, and they opened them. The bubbler pool drained over the next several hours. The catastrophe was averted. There is a famous version of this story, which was repeated by various sources, including the HBO miniseries about Chernobyl, in which all three men received fatal doses of radiation and died shortly afterwards. This is, somewhat surprisingly, not really what happened. All three men survived the immediate aftermath. Boris Baranov died of a heart attack in 2005, almost 20 years after the accident, at the age of 64, although whether his death was related to his exposure is unclear. Alexei Ananenko and Valery Bezpalov were both still alive as of recent reports in 2024, and Ananenko continued to work in the nuclear industry for many years after the disaster. In 2018, all three were awarded the Order for Courage by the Ukrainian government, and in 2019, they were named Heroes of Ukraine. So the heroism is real, the sacrifice was real, but the men did not die. They went on with their lives. The total death toll from Chernobyl is somewhat famously disputed. The immediate death toll was 30, mostly from acute radiation syndrome and the explosion itself. The longer-term death toll from cancers and other radiation-related illnesses is much harder to estimate because cancer can have many causes, and the radiation doses from Chernobyl were spread over a large population at relatively low individual levels. Estimates of the eventual total death toll range from about 4,000, which is the World Health Organization's estimate for the affected populations in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, to as high as several 100,000 in some of the more pessimistic studies. The most cited number, which is from the Chernobyl Forum report in 2005, is around 4,000. The economic cost of the accident is estimated at around $200 billion over the years, although some estimates put it higher. The political consequences were also enormous. Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time of the accident, said many years later that the Chernobyl disaster was a more important factor in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union than perestroika, his program of liberal reforms. The disaster exposed the dysfunction of the Soviet system, the secrecy, the bureaucratic paralysis, the willingness to sacrifice individual workers to cover up institutional failures. It contributed to a loss of public trust that, combined with other factors, would lead to the dissolution of the Soviet Union by the end of 1991. The Chernobyl plant continued to operate for years after the accident. The last reactor was not shut down until 2000. The exclusion zone around the plant, which is about 1,000 square miles in area, is still in place today, though it has, in recent decades, become a kind of accidental wildlife preserve because the absence of humans has allowed populations of wolves, bears, lynx, and other animals to recover in ways they have not been able to elsewhere in Europe. The plant itself is now enclosed in a much larger steel arch structure called the New Safe Confinement, which was completed in 2016 and which is designed to last for at least 100 years. The remains of Reactor 4 are still inside, still radioactive, still being slowly cleaned up. So Chernobyl was the worst until it was not. In March of 2011, an earthquake and tsunami in Japan caused another nuclear accident that was eventually rated, along with Chernobyl, at level 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, which is the maximum rating. That accident was at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant on the east coast of Honshu Island. The accident at Fukushima was, in a way, the result of a series of design and planning decisions that went back decades. The plant was built in the 1960s and 70s with 6 boiling water reactors of varying sizes and ages, all sitting on a low coastal plain that had been leveled down from the original cliffs to make construction easier. The plant had a seawall, but the seawall was about 30 feet high, which was considered adequate based on the historical record of tsunamis at the time the plant was designed. The backup diesel generators, which were supposed to provide emergency power if the grid failed, were located in the basements of the reactor buildings. Several scientific studies in the 1990s and 2000s had suggested that the historical record was incomplete and that tsunamis significantly larger than the seawall could occur on this coast. But those warnings had not led to any major changes at the plant. On the 11th of March, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck off the east coast of Japan. It was one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded. The reactors at Fukushima Daiichi, the 3 that were operating at the time, automatically shut down within seconds of the earthquake, as they were designed to do. The control rods dropped into the cores. The chain reactions stopped. So far, everything was working as intended. The earthquake itself did not seriously damage the plant. The problem was what came next. About 50 minutes after the earthquake, the tsunami arrived. It was much larger than the seawall, with waves of about 45 feet at the Fukushima Daiichi site. The tsunami overtopped the seawall, flooded the plant, and disabled the backup diesel generators, which were sitting in the flooded basements. The plant lost all external electrical power, all backup generator power, and basically all of its battery backup within a few hours. Without power, the cooling pumps could not run. The cores of the 3 operating reactors, which had been shut down but were still producing residual heat from the decay of fission products, began to overheat. Over the next 3 days, the cores of reactors 1, 2, and 3 all melted down. The zirconium cladding on the fuel rods, when it gets above about 1200 degrees Celsius, reacts with steam to produce hydrogen gas. The hydrogen built up inside the reactor buildings, and on the 12th of March, the building containing Reactor 1 exploded due to a hydrogen explosion. Reactor 3's building exploded on the 14th. Reactor 2's containment was damaged on the 15th, although it did not have the same kind of visible explosion. The roof of Reactor 4's building, which had been shut down for maintenance but had spent fuel stored in its cooling pool, also exploded. Unlike Chernobyl, the Fukushima reactors had containment buildings, and the containments mostly held. The radioactive releases were much smaller than at Chernobyl, although they were still significant. The Japanese government evacuated a zone with a 20-kilometer radius around the plant, which is about 12 miles, and roughly 150,000 people had to leave their homes. Many of them have still not been able to return more than a decade later. The cleanup of the site is ongoing and is expected to take decades. The estimated cost of the disaster is around $200 billion, comparable to Chernobyl. The direct death toll from Fukushima in terms of radiation-related deaths has been very low. The World Health Organization and other studies have concluded that while there is some increased risk of certain cancers in the immediate area, the actual measurable health impact has been small. There was one death of a worker from lung cancer in 2018 that the Japanese government acknowledged was caused by radiation exposure at the plant. There have been other deaths attributed to the stress of evacuation, suicide of evacuees, and difficulties experienced by elderly people forced from their homes, which collectively are sometimes called indirect deaths or evacuation deaths. The Japanese government estimates several thousand such deaths, although attributing any specific death to the accident is very difficult. The accident triggered a major reassessment of nuclear power in Japan. All of the country's nuclear reactors were shut down for safety inspections within months of the disaster. Many have since been restarted, but as of recent data, Japan's nuclear share of electricity generation is around 8% compared to about 30% before the accident. Germany, looking at what had happened in Japan, decided to phase out all of its nuclear reactors, a process that was completed in April of 2023, when the last 3 German reactors were shut down. Several other countries either delayed or canceled planned nuclear projects. The Fukushima accident also produced one of the strange, ongoing scientific and political stories of the past decade, which is the question of what to do with the contaminated water at the site. Cooling water has been continuously pumped through the destroyed reactors to keep the fuel debris cool, and that water becomes contaminated with various radioactive isotopes. The Japanese authorities have been treating the water to remove most of the contamination, but tritium, which is a radioactive form of hydrogen, cannot be easily removed because it is chemically identical to ordinary hydrogen. The accumulated water, more than 1 million tons of it, has been stored in tanks on the site, but the tanks are running out of space. In August of 2023, Japan began releasing the treated water into the ocean, after diluting it to levels well below international safety standards. This caused significant diplomatic friction with China and South Korea, both of which banned imports of Japanese seafood in response. The scientific consensus is that the discharge is safe at the concentrations involved, but the political and economic effects have been considerable. Okay, so there is one more accident I want to talk about because it does not get nearly enough attention and because it is, in some ways, the most awful single industrial accident I have ever read about. That is the Tokaimura criticality accident in 1999 in Japan. Tokaimura is a town in Ibaraki Prefecture, about 80 miles northeast of Tokyo. It has been a center of Japanese nuclear research and industry since the 1960s. In 1999, a company called JCO, which was a subsidiary of Sumitomo Metal Mining, was operating a small uranium fuel preparation plant in Tokaimura. The plant was producing fuel for a Japanese experimental reactor called Joyo. The process involved dissolving uranium oxide in nitric acid to make uranyl nitrate solution, which was then processed further into fuel pellets. The plant had detailed procedures for how to do this safely. The key safety consideration was that you could never put too much enriched uranium into a single container at once, because if you did, you could cause a criticality accident where the uranium would spontaneously start a chain reaction. On the 30th of September 1999, three workers, Hisashi Auchi, Masato Shinohara, and Yutaka Yokokawa, were preparing a batch of fuel that involved uranium enriched to 19%, which was higher than usual. The plant was behind schedule, and the management had been pushing the workers to find ways to speed up the process. According to the official procedures, the uranium oxide was supposed to be dissolved in a long, narrow tank called a dissolution tank, which was specifically shaped to prevent enough uranium from accumulating in one place to cause a criticality. The tank's geometry was a safety feature. From there, the solution was supposed to be transferred to a buffer tank, also shaped to prevent criticality, and then to a precipitation tank for further processing. The workers had been told by their supervisors to skip the dissolution and buffer tanks entirely. Instead, they were using stainless steel buckets to mix the uranium oxide and the nitric acid by hand, and then pouring the solution directly into the precipitation tank, which was a wider, rounder tank that was much more likely to allow criticality if too much uranium was in it. This was a serious violation of the safety procedures, but it had been done before on this and on previous batches with no obvious consequences. The supervisors had also told the workers that they could use up to twice the legally permitted amount of uranium per batch because that would speed up the work. The official documentation referred to a manual called the back manual, which described shortcuts to be used to expedite operations and which had been kept hidden from regulators. So, on this particular day, the workers were pouring stainless steel buckets of enriched uranyl nitrate solution into the precipitation tank. After they had poured the seventh bucket, the total amount of uranium in the tank reached critical mass. The tank started to sustain a chain reaction. There was a bright blue flash, the result of Cherenkov radiation from electrons moving faster than the speed of light in water. The chain reaction continued intermittently for the next 20 hours. Hisashi Aochi, who was leaning over the tank and pouring the bucket at the moment of criticality, received an estimated dose of about 17 sieverts of radiation. To put that number in context, a dose of about 6 to 10 sieverts is considered universally fatal. 17 sieverts is well beyond what is theoretically survivable. Masato Shinohara, who was standing nearby, received about 10 sieverts, which is also a fatal dose. Yutaka Yokokawa, who was further away, received about 3 sieverts, which is severe but potentially survivable. What happened next, and the reason I think this story is one of the most disturbing in modern medical history, is that the Japanese medical system attempted to keep Hisashi Aochi alive. Aochi was 35 years old initially. When he arrived at the hospital, he looked relatively normal. He had some redness on his skin. He was nauseous, but he was conscious and could talk. Within hours, however, the radiation damage to his body became apparent. His chromosomes had been destroyed. His cells could no longer reproduce. His immune system collapsed. His skin began to slough off. He was transferred to a specialized radiation injury facility at the University of Tokyo Hospital, where doctors performed the first ever stem cell transplant for radiation injury using stem cells donated by his sister. Over the next 83 days, Aochi's body underwent a level of suffering that, by basically every account, was beyond what anyone had ever seen. His skin literally fell off. He suffered massive internal bleeding. His heart stopped multiple times and was restarted. His family pleaded with the doctors to stop treatment, and Aochi himself, in his rare moments of consciousness, reportedly asked to be allowed to die. But the doctors continued treatment, partly because the Japanese government was using his case as a research opportunity, and partly because of the medical culture of not giving up. He finally died of multiple organ failure on the 21st of December, 1999. Masato Shinohara survived for 211 days and died in April of 2000. Yutaka Yokokawa, the third worker, who had received a much smaller dose, eventually recovered, though he was charged with criminal negligence in connection with the accident. The Tokaimura accident led to a major overhaul of nuclear safety regulation in Japan. The JCO company was prosecuted, with several executives receiving prison sentences. The plant was permanently shut down. New regulations were imposed on the entire Japanese nuclear industry. But the human cost, in particular Aochi's prolonged suffering, became a kind of cautionary tale that is still cited in discussions about radiation protection, about medical ethics, and about the relationship between industrial cost cutting and worker safety. Okay, so let me talk about something a little less grim, which is the question of what to do with nuclear waste. Because this is one of the things about nuclear power that people bring up the most. And the story of how it has been handled, particularly in the United States, is a kind of slow motion disaster of a different kind. So, when uranium fuel is used in a reactor, about 3 to 5% of the uranium 235 gets fissioned, producing energy and fission products. The fission products, which are smaller atoms like cesium and strontium and iodine, are usually highly radioactive, but they have relatively short half-lives, ranging from seconds to a few decades. Within a few hundred years, most of them have decayed away. The bigger problem in terms of long-term waste is the heavier elements that get produced when uranium 238 absorbs neutrons but does not fission. These include plutonium, americium, neptunium, and curium, collectively called actinides or transuranic elements. They have half-lives ranging from hundreds to hundreds of thousands of years, and some of them are both highly radioactive and chemically toxic. When a fuel assembly is removed from a reactor after typically 3 to 5 years of use, it is what is called spent fuel. About 95% of the original uranium is still in the assembly, along with about 1% plutonium and about 4% fission products. The whole assembly is extremely radioactive and is generating a lot of heat from the decay of the fission products. It is moved into a spent fuel pool, which is a deep pool of water next to the reactor, where it sits for at least 5 years to allow the short-lived fission products to decay and the heat output to drop. After that, the spent fuel can either be sent for reprocessing, where the uranium and plutonium are chemically separated out and recycled into new fuel, or it can be moved into dry cask storage, which is a heavy steel and concrete container designed to hold the fuel for decades. The problem is that, in the long run, neither spent fuel pools nor dry casks are intended as permanent storage. They are temporary solutions designed to hold the waste until a permanent repository becomes available. And in the United States, despite more than 40 years of effort and around $15 billion of spending, there is no permanent repository. The story of how this happened is, in its way, one of the more pathetic episodes in American government. In 1982, Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which directed the Department of Energy to develop a deep geological repository for spent fuel and high-level waste. The Department of Energy was supposed to begin accepting waste at the repository by January of 1998. The act outlined a process for selecting a site, evaluating multiple candidates, and choosing the best one based on scientific and technical criteria. In 1987, Congress amended the act to short-circuit this process. Instead of evaluating multiple candidates, Congress designated Yucca Mountain in Nevada as the only site to be considered. The other two candidates that had been under serious consideration were in Washington State and Texas. According to a member of the House Senate Conference Committee at the time, the choice was made not on technical grounds, but on political grounds. The Speaker of the House at the time, Jim Wright, was from Texas, so it could not go to Texas. The House Majority Leader, Tom Foley, was from Washington State, so it could not go to Washington. That left Nevada, which had less political clout than the other two, so it got Yucca Mountain. The relevant phrase which the member of the committee used when explaining this to a Nevada congressman was, according to the historical record, that, quote, political science triumphed over earth science, end quote. Yucca Mountain, which is in a remote part of southern Nevada, about 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas, was studied extensively for more than 2 decades. Around $15 billion was spent on geological and engineering studies. Tunnels were excavated into the mountain to allow scientists to study the rock formations. The Department of Energy submitted a formal license application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2008, asking for permission to construct the repository. Then, in 2010, the Obama administration, which had committed during the campaign to terminating the project, attempted to withdraw the license application. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's licensing board ruled that the Department of Energy did not have the legal authority to unilaterally withdraw the application. A series of court cases followed. As of recent reports, the application is still technically pending, although no actual construction has occurred at Yucca Mountain for more than a decade. Both major political parties have, at various points, committed to either reviving or definitively killing the project, but no actual progress has been made. In the meantime, the spent fuel keeps piling up. As of recent estimates, there are about 90,000 tons of spent fuel and high-level waste stored at more than 70 reactor sites across the United States. The amount grows by about 2,000 tons per year. Most of it is in dry cask storage, which is considered safe for decades, but not for the thousands of years that the waste will remain dangerous. The federal government, having failed to begin accepting waste in 1998, as it was legally required to do, has been paying damages to utility companies for the cost of storing the waste on their sites. By recent estimates, the federal liability for these damages is over $40 billion, and growing. Other countries have, in various ways, done better. Finland is currently constructing a deep geological repository called Onkalo, which is being excavated into the bedrock of the country's south coast. It is the first permanent repository for spent fuel anywhere in the world. The first canisters of spent fuel are expected to be placed there in the late 2020s. France has a major reprocessing facility at La Hague in Normandy, which extracts the plutonium and uranium from spent fuel for recycling, reducing the volume of high-level waste. Sweden has a research repository at ASPO and is working on a final repository at Forsmark. Several other countries are in various stages of developing their own facilities. But in the United States, the largest nuclear power producer in the world, there is still no permanent solution. Okay, so let me get to the more fun part of this, which is some of the strange things that happened during the atomic age that did not really go anywhere, but which are kind of a window into the culture of the 1950s and 60s around nuclear technology. So, we already talked about the Atoms for Peace program and the bowling alley reactor company. What I have not mentioned yet is the fact that in the 1950s, a lot of people, including very serious engineers at major corporations, genuinely believed that nuclear power was going to revolutionize basically every aspect of consumer technology, including, of all things, the family car. So, the Ford Motor Company in 1958 unveiled a concept car called the Nucleon. It was a 3/8 scale fiberglass model painted candy apple red with silver trim, and the idea behind it was that it would be a passenger car powered by a small onboard nuclear reactor. The reactor would be located at the back of the car, suspended between two booms, like a fighter plane's twin tail. The driver and passengers would sit in a forward-mounted cabin far away from the reactor. The reactor would generate steam, which would drive a turbine, which would turn the wheels. According to Ford's specifications, the Nucleon would travel 5,000 miles before the reactor would need to be replaced, and the replacement would happen at specialized charging stations that would, in Ford's words, replace the present-day service station as it is known today. The Nucleon was, of course, never actually built. The reasons should be obvious. A nuclear reactor compact enough to fit in a car would still require, by basic physics, about 50 tons of radiation shielding, which is about 25 times the weight of a normal car. The radiation shielding cannot be miniaturized because the laws of physics governing how radiation interacts with matter do not change just because Ford would like them to. There is also the small matter of what happens in a traffic accident. A fender bender in a Nucleon would, depending on the severity, range from a routine insurance claim to a regional radioactive contamination event. None of these problems were ever solved because the basic premise was never going to work. But for a few years in the late 1950s, the Nucleon was actually treated as a serious vision of the future. Newsweek ran an article about it titled, quote, "The Atomic Car of the Future," end quote, asking, with apparent sincerity, whether this was where automotive design was heading. The model is now on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. The Nucleon was not the only nuclear concept car. Studebaker-Packard produced a concept called the Astral, which was supposedly going to run on either a nuclear engine or beamed energy from an external source. and which would generate a force field around itself to prevent collisions. Ford also produced a concept called the Seattle IT-21, which was a nuclear-powered six-wheeled car that was unveiled at the Seattle World's Fair in 1962. None of these were ever produced, obviously. The technical problems were insurmountable. The regulatory problems were worse. And as the 1950s, enthusiasm for atomic everything cooled off. The concepts were just retired. There was also, separately, a serious effort by the United States Air Force to build a nuclear-powered bomber which would be able to stay airborne for weeks at a time, circling the Soviet Union, ready to drop nuclear bombs the moment it was ordered to. The program, which was called the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Program, ran from 1946 until 1961, spent more than $1 billion in 1960s money, and produced exactly one experimental aircraft, the NB-36H, which carried an operating reactor as test cargo but never actually flew under nuclear power. The reactor was too heavy. The radiation shielding required to protect the crew was too thick, and even with the shielding, the radiation exposure to the crew during a long flight would have been unacceptable. The program was eventually cancelled by President Kennedy, who pointed out that no nuclear-powered aircraft had actually been demonstrated to be feasible and that the project had been consuming money for 15 years with no result. The Soviets, who also worked on nuclear-powered aircraft, also failed to produce a working one, although they got closer than the Americans, having built a Tupolev Tu-119 that actually flew with the reactor on board, although the reactor was not connected to the engines. There were also nuclear-powered cargo ships, which actually did work. The NS Savannah, which was an American ship, was launched in 1959 and operated for about 10 years before being retired. It was a beautiful vessel with a sleek cruise ship design intended to showcase the peaceful uses of nuclear power. It made port calls in cities around the world as part of the Atoms for Peace program, but it was never economically competitive with conventional ships because the cost of operating and maintaining its reactor was much higher than the cost of running diesel engines. There were also several Soviet and German nuclear-powered cargo ships, all of which had similar problems. Today, the only nuclear-powered commercial vessels still in operation are a handful of Russian icebreakers, which use nuclear power to break through Arctic ice and which work because they need to stay at sea for long periods without refueling. And there were nuclear-powered satellites and probes which work and are still in use, although mostly for deep space missions where solar power does not work well. The Voyager spacecraft, which were launched in 1977 and are now well outside the solar system, are powered by radioisotope thermoelectric generators, which use the heat from decaying plutonium-238 to generate electricity. They are still operating faintly more than 45 years after launch. The Curiosity and Perseverance rovers on Mars are also powered by radioisotope generators, which is why they keep functioning at full capability through the Martian nights when solar-powered rovers like Spirit and Opportunity had to shut down at night to conserve power. Okay, so coming back to the main thread, where is nuclear power now? So the situation, as of recent data, is that there are about 440 operating commercial nuclear reactors worldwide, producing about 9% of global electricity. The United States has the most reactors, with about 94 operating, producing about 20% of American electricity, which is around 45% of the country's carbon-free electricity. France has the highest nuclear share in the world, with about 65 to 70% of its electricity coming from nuclear, depending on the year and how much maintenance the fleet is undergoing. China is the fastest growing nuclear power, having added more than 50 reactors since 1991 and currently constructing about 28 more. Russia is the largest exporter of nuclear technology, with its state-owned nuclear company, Rosatom, building reactors in countries around the world. South Korea has a large, well-operated nuclear fleet. Japan has been slowly restarting its reactors after the Fukushima shutdowns. And then there are countries that have decided to phase out nuclear power entirely, including Germany, which shut down its last reactors in 2023, and Italy, which voted to abandon nuclear power after Chernobyl and has not had any operating reactors since the early 1990s. The economics of nuclear power are, at the moment, kind of complicated. A new conventional, large-scale nuclear plant takes about 10 to 15 years to build, costs anywhere from $10 to $30 billion depending on the project and the country, and competes against natural gas, wind, and solar, all of which are much cheaper per unit of energy produced. The advantage of nuclear is that it produces a lot of baseload power, meaning power that is constantly available regardless of weather or time of day, with very low carbon emissions per unit of electricity. The disadvantage is the cost, the long construction time, and the regulatory complexity. As a result, almost no new conventional nuclear plants have been started in Western countries in the past 2 decades, although there are some recent exceptions, including a couple of plants in the United States that were completed in 2023 and 2024 after long and expensive delays. The latest big idea in the nuclear industry is the small modular reactor, or SMR. The basic concept is that instead of building one huge reactor, which has to be custom designed and built on site over many years, you build a bunch of smaller reactors, each one with maybe 1/10 the capacity of a conventional one in a factory. The smaller reactors can be mass produced shipped to the site as more or less complete units, and then assembled into a plant by linking several of them together. The argument is that this should reduce the cost, the construction time, and the risk of cost overruns by leveraging the same kind of economies of scale that have made other manufactured goods cheap. As of recent reports, there are about 70 to 80 different small modular reactor designs being developed worldwide. Russia has actually built and deployed one called the Academic Lomonosov, which is a floating nuclear power plant with two 35-megawatt reactors. It started operating in 2020 in a port on the Russian Arctic coast. China has built a land-based small modular reactor called the Linglong 1, which went critical in late 2023. The United States has several designs in various stages of development. NuScale, which was the first American company to get a small modular reactor design approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, was working on a project in Idaho that was canceled in 2023 due to rising costs. TerraPower, which is funded in part by Bill Gates, is building a reactor in Wyoming. X Energy is developing a high-temperature, gas-cooled small modular reactor. There are several others. Whether any of these will actually deliver on the promise of cheap, fast, mass-produced nuclear power is, at this point, an open question. The economics depend on building a lot of them, which requires demand, which requires the technology to be proven and cost competitive, which requires building the first few without the benefit of economies of scale. There is, in a real sense, a chicken and egg problem with the whole concept. Some analysts are optimistic, others are skeptical. The next decade or so will probably determine whether small modular reactors are going to be a major part of the global energy mix or just another nuclear technology that got more attention than it deserved. There has also been, in the past few years, an unexpected new driver for nuclear power, which is the energy demand from data centers, particularly those running artificial intelligence applications. Training and running large AI models consumes enormous amounts of electricity, and the technology companies operating the data centers need power that is available 24 hours a day with very high reliability, and ideally with low carbon emissions to meet their corporate environmental commitments. This is basically the exact profile that nuclear power provides. In 2024, several major technology companies, including Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Meta, signed deals to either restart, shut down nuclear plants, or to develop new nuclear capacity to power their data centers. Microsoft, in particular, signed a deal to restart 3 Mile Island Unit 1, the undamaged reactor at the same site as the famous accident, to provide power for its AI operations. The reactor is expected to come back online in 2028 under the new name of Crane Clean Energy Center. So that is more or less where we are. Nuclear power has gone through several phases in its history. From the late 1940s to the early 1970s, it was treated as the cheap, abundant energy source of the future and was built rapidly in many countries. From the early 1970s to the early 2000s, it was treated as a dangerous, expensive technology that was politically unpopular, and almost no new plants were built. From the early 2000s to about the late 20 teens, there was a, quote, nuclear renaissance, end quote, in which several new plants were planned, although most of them were cancelled or delayed due to cost overruns. And in the past few years, there has been another surge of interest driven by climate concerns, energy security worries, and the demand from data centers. Whether this latest cycle of enthusiasm will produce many new reactors or whether it will fade like the previous ones remains to be seen. What I keep coming back to, after spending way too much time reading about this, is how strange the technology is, in a way that I do not think gets talked about enough. It is a technology that was invented by a small number of physicists working in the 1930s and 40s, many of whom were refugees from totalitarian regimes, several of whom were Jewish women who got systematically shut out of the recognition for their work. It was first demonstrated in a converted squash court in Chicago by a team that celebrated their success with a single bottle of cheap Italian wine and paper cups. Its first practical application was as a weapon used to incinerate two cities and end a war. Its first commercial application was a side product of a submarine program run by a difficult Polish-American admiral who personally interviewed every officer who would ever be allowed to operate one. It has had a small number of really bad accidents, each of which has had outsized effects on public perception. It produces, by a wide margin, the most energy from the smallest amount of material of any technology humans have ever invented. And it produces waste that will remain dangerous for longer than most human civilizations have ever existed. And the waste is what I want to close on. Modern nuclear waste, which is dangerous for at least 10,000 years, raises a question that humans have never really had to deal with before, which is how you communicate across a span of time much longer than recorded history, that something is dangerous and should not be disturbed. The pyramids of Egypt are about 5,000 years old. The cave paintings at Lascaux are about 17,000 years old. The oldest human structures we know of are around 12,000 years old. We are asking the people of the year 12,026 to know that the canisters buried at Yucca Mountain or Oncalo or wherever the eventual repository ends up being contain something they should not dig up. There has been actual academic work on how to design warning markers for nuclear waste repositories that will remain understandable across spans of time longer than any existing human language has ever lasted. Proposals have included giant spike fields designed to look threatening from a distance, architecture intended to create a sense of dread, faces carved into stone in expressions of horror, symbols designed to be read by the cultures of the far future. Some of the proposals are genuinely strange. The point is that we are now in the position of trying to communicate with our own descendants 10,000 years out about a danger that we ourselves created, that, in some sense, is the legacy of nuclear power. It is a technology that produces enormous amounts of useful energy with very low immediate environmental impact, but with a kind of long shadow that extends much further into the future than most of our other industrial decisions. It is a technology that has saved countless lives by displacing coal and gas plants that would have produced air pollution and greenhouse gases, and it has cost a relatively small number of lives, mostly in a few well-known accidents. It is a technology that we still do not really know what to do with in the long run, in part because the long run for it is so long. And it is a technology that, having existed for less than a century, is now being looked at again as one of the main ways we might address climate change, despite the fact that we never really got around to building enough of it the first time, which I think is the contradiction I mentioned at the start. The cleanest, most efficient way humans have figured out to produce electricity, the one that almost nobody wants, the one that, if we had built more of it back when it was the future, we would not need to be having this conversation now, and the one that, as of right now, is once again being considered by countries and companies and governments all over the world as the way forward. It is hard to say whether this time it will actually happen. The last several rounds of nuclear enthusiasm have mostly fizzled out, but it is being talked about again more than it has been in decades. And the technology that started in a basement in Paris in 1896 with a Frenchman developing a photographic plate that he was reasonably sure had nothing on it is, after almost 130 years, somehow still in the conversation about what comes next. Anyway, that is everything I can think of, more or less, about nuclear energy. From Becquerel to small modular reactors, from the Demon Core to the divers under Reactor 4, from Lise Meitner walking in the snow with her nephew to a Hungarian physicist crossing the street in London and seeing a chain reaction in his head from a converted squash court in Chicago to a flooded basement in Tokaimura. It is going through it from start to finish, way stranger and way sadder and way more impressive than any single description of it can really capture. And it is, by basically every measure of energy density, the most efficient thing we have ever figured out how to do, even if we mostly stopped doing it. Thanks for listening. I hope this helped you get to sleep.